The woman standing outside the bedroom door at Buckingham Palace on the afternoon of May 6, 1910, had spent 11 years learning to stand in rooms without being seen. She had trained herself to read a door the way other women read faces. She could sense from a single glance at the posture of a footman whether she was going to be welcomed or turned away. She had been turned away before. She had been rerouted, delayed, and politely redirected by people whose entire professional purpose was to manage her existence. Alice Keppel was 41 years old, still beautiful, and she was shaking so hard she could barely hold herself upright. The king was dying inside that room. She had known it for weeks, known it with the particular knowledge of a woman who had watched a man more carefully than anyone except perhaps his physician. She had watched the color leave his face in stages. She had watched the cough arrive and refuse to leave. She had watched him eat less and sit differently, the way a man begins unconsciously to conserve what remains of himself. She had watched all of this from her fixed position, not inside the inner circle, never that, but close enough that she could see the inner circle's distress before the inner circle chose to acknowledge it. His wife was in that room. Queen Alexandra had arrived back from visiting her brother in Corfu just the day before, and the difference between her knowledge and Alice's knowledge was that Alexandra's was official, declared, and hers was not. Both women knew the king was dying. Only one of them had the right to hold his hand in front of the servants. Alice was summoned, not by the Queen but by the king himself. He had apparently asked for her. He had been refusing to lie down all day, had been insisting he would go on working, had been brought his papers while barely able to stay conscious, and somewhere in that stubborn, frightened nobility he had asked for Alice. A letter existed. She had shown it to Alexandra. The king had written years earlier that he wanted her by his side at the end. Alexandra, who had reasons beyond counting to refuse, allowed it. What happened inside that room is a matter of competing accounts from people who were not fully inside it, and from people who were inside it and chose to remember it differently. What is certain is that Alice Keppel entered, that the king was conscious briefly, that he commended her to his wife in some fashion that various witnesses heard and remembered in various ways. And what is certain is that when the king lost consciousness, Queen Alexandra turned to the doctor and said in a voice that had shed every trace of its usual warmth, "Get that woman away." Alice was dragged, or helped, or simply steered through a door. Depending on who is telling the story, she was screaming, or weeping, or rigid with a grief she could not manage in public. At least one account has her crying out that there had been nothing wrong, that she had never done anything to be ashamed of. Whether that was madness from grief or a last, desperate attempt to reassert the code she had followed so faithfully for 11 years, nobody still living can say. The woman who had been so perfectly composed for so long, in so many difficult rooms, fell apart entirely at the moment the last protection was removed. She was not permitted to be present at the funeral as herself. She was allowed to attend eventually through a side entrance. That moment, the entrance and the exit, the summoning and the ordering away, tells you most of what you need to know about the particular world these women inhabited. A world with no rules written down, where the only currency was discretion and the only penalty for spending it was everything. A world where a woman could be beloved by a king for 11 years and still not be permitted to cry over his coffin with her name attached. A world where the woman who lived inside it longest and managed it best was still in the end managed herself. This is the story of the women around King Edward VII. Not just Alice Keppel, though she may have been the most accomplished of them all. Not just Lillie Langtry, who was the first to be truly public about it and paid a different kind of price. Not just Daisy Warwick, who kept his letters for 14 years and then, when she needed money badly enough, nearly sold everything he had trusted her with. Not even Alexandra herself, who knew everything from the beginning and said almost none of it. This is the story of what silence costs, and what it was designed to protect, and why it failed so precisely in some cases and held so firmly in others. Edward Albert arrived on the 9th of November 1841, the second child and first son of Queen Victoria and Prince Albert of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha. His parents were waiting for a specific kind of child. What they got was the wrong kind entirely. Victoria and Albert had built their marriage and the early years of the Victorian monarchy on a very deliberate idea that the British royal family could be reformed from the inside. They could be made respectable, made moral, made rigorous. They could be separated from the dissolute Hanoverian men who had come before them, the ones who had kept mistresses in official apartments, and died of combinations of gout and excess, and had their names attached to satirical cartoons in newspapers their secretaries burned before they arrived at the breakfast table. Albert especially believed this. He was a German prince with a continental intellectual seriousness and a genuine horror of mess. He had a plan for the monarchy, a plan for Europe's stability, and a plan for the son who would inherit both. He drew up an educational program for Bertie that has since been studied with the kind of horrified fascination normally reserved for evidence in criminal trials. Every hour of the boy's day was scheduled. Languages, history, mathematics, religion, philosophy, and at the center of all of it, an uncompromising emphasis on moral self-discipline. Baron Stockmar, who had been helping to manage Albert's intellectual life since before Bertie was born, contributed to the curriculum, and Stockmar was not a man who had given much thought to the concept of appropriate expectations for small children. He wanted a perfect machine for constitutional governance. Albert wanted a perfect son. Victoria wanted a version of Albert she could raise herself, since she had missed the original through no fault of her own. What they had was a boy who could not sit still, hated Latin, loved the company of other people, and cried easily. The tutors reported back constantly. Every report was a variation on the same theme. The boy was not progressing. The boy was distracted. The boy had made the chambermaid laugh again when he should have been conjugating German verbs. Albert and Victoria wrote to each other about their son with a level of despair that would have been excessive if he had burned a village, and their letters were preserved so that historians could spend subsequent decades reading them and wondering how two adults could be simultaneously so worried and so unkind. Victoria wrote in 1858, when Bertie was 16, that her son possessed a small, empty brain. She wrote this about her own child, and she committed it to paper in a form that survived her by more than 100 years. Whatever she meant by it, she was wrong. Bertie was not unintelligent. He was simply a different kind of intelligent than the kind his parents could recognize or value. He was good at people. He could read a room in seconds. He could make strangers feel welcome and important and interesting within moments of meeting them. He could remember names and faces and the particular things that mattered to each person, and he was later, as a king, to demonstrate a diplomatic skill that his mother's ministers would come to rely on heavily. But none of these abilities registered as abilities in the program his parents had designed. They registered as distractions. The more they pressed him, the more he retreated into exactly the things they wanted to eliminate. By the time he reached young adulthood, he had learned something that took some people an entire lifetime, that if you are told you cannot have the thing you want, wanting it becomes the most interesting thing about you. In the summer of 1861, Bertie was 19 years old and attending military exercises at the Curragh camp in Ireland. His fellow officers, who liked him very much, had a plan. They smuggled a young actress named Nellie Clifton into his quarters. She was, as these stories always specify, connected in some capacity to the theatrical world, and therefore entirely the wrong kind of person for the heir to the throne to be involved with. The gossip travelled through the British aristocracy at its customary pace, which is to say immediately. Prince Albert found out in November. He was already ill, already worn down by decades of the particular exhaustion that comes from being right about everything and being unable to make anyone else see it, and the news about Nellie Clifton broke something in him that had perhaps been close to breaking anyway. He wrote Bertie a letter of 16 pages. The letter was saturated with the specific language of a man who feels personally betrayed by a biological event he had no way to prevent. He could not bring himself to see Bertie in person. Then, feeling the weight of duty pressing against the weight of his own diminishment, he travelled to Cambridge in November rain to confront his son face to face. They walked the grounds together for hours while Albert coughed, shivered, and deteriorated in what any doctor watching might have identified as an extremely bad idea. 3 weeks later, on the 14th of December, 1861, Prince Albert died. He was 42 years old. The official cause was typhoid fever, though modern medical historians have spent considerable effort suggesting that the chronic stomach ailments he had suffered for years point more convincingly toward abdominal cancer or Crohn's disease, with the typhoid as a final complication rather than the cause. It does not matter very much clinically. What matters is what came after. Victoria blamed Bertie. She blamed him fully, immediately, and permanently. She wrote to her eldest daughter Vicky, who had married into the Prussian royal family, that the fall, meaning the Nellie Clifton business, had killed his father, and that she could never look at the boy without a shudder. She meant it. She kept meaning it. She was still meaning it 30 years later, when Bertie had been Prince of Wales long enough that the title felt like a parody. She locked him out of government entirely. No access to state papers, no diplomatic briefings, no cabinet consultations. The heir to the greatest empire in the world was permitted to cut ribbons, attend ceremonial dinners, and wait. So he waited, and he did what people do when they have enormous amounts of unfilled time and no one whose opinion they respect telling them to stop. He filled the time with everything his parents had forbidden. He ate, he gambled, he traveled, he smoked 12 cigars a day. He became, in the precise and specific vocabulary of London's gossip columns, a magnificent consumer of everything this world had on offer, and he began, systematically and with genuine feeling, to fall in love with women who were not his wife. His wife, who married him in 1863, was a Danish princess named Alexandra. She was 25 when they married, and she was already learning what the life she had agreed to actually involved. Alexandra Caroline Marie Charlotte Louise Julia was born on the 1st of December 1844, the eldest daughter of Prince Christian of Denmark and Princess Louise of Hesse-Kassel. Denmark was not the richest or most powerful of the European royal houses. The Danish royals were respectably aristocratic and comfortably housed, but they were not in the business of competing with the great German powers or the British Empire in either territory or treasure. Alexandra grew up in a modest palace in Copenhagen, close to her siblings, affectionate with her parents, and possessed of such remarkable beauty that by the time she reached her teens, royal matchmakers from half of Europe had already marked her name in their notebooks. She was tall, with a particular kind of composed grace that did not look learned, though it certainly was. She had a quality that photographs of the period managed to convey even through the technical limitations of early cameras. She looked as though whatever she was looking at deserved her full attention. Not everyone has this. It is not entirely natural. It is partly the product of a self-discipline so complete that it reads as ease, and partly the product of genuine interest in the people around her, and partly something else that cannot quite be named. She married Bertie at St. George's Chapel, Windsor, in March of 1863, in a ceremony that all of fashionable Europe attended or read about in enormous detail. She was 19, he was 21. He was by almost every account charmed and pleased with her, and she with him. The early years of their marriage had a warmth that courtiers who spent decades being cynical about royal families found genuinely surprising. Then Alexandra's hearing began to fail. Otosclerosis is a hereditary condition that progressively hardens the bones of the inner ear. Alexandra's mother had it. Alexandra had inherited it. The deafness came on gradually enough that she could compensate for it in public, could position herself carefully at gatherings, could develop the particular skill of watching mouths and reading context that people with hearing loss often develop without consciously deciding to. But at Bertie's dinner parties, where the conversation moved at the pace and volume of people who were having exactly as much fun as they appeared to be having, she was increasingly stranded. Bertie's world, the Marlborough House set as it came to be called, ran on noise and speed. Every evening was populated by the same cast of well-connected, quick-witted and expensive people. Every dinner moved fast. The jokes were rapid, the references were current. The whole performance required a kind of real-time engagement that Alexandra, sitting with her particular composed attention in the middle of it, could no longer fully access. She compensated by watching what she could see instead of listening. She watched faces. She watched the way people positioned themselves near her husband. She watched who leaned toward him and who leaned away, who got the whole body turn and who got the polite attention. In a room where everyone was pretending that everything was normal, she became the best reader of what was not. A bout of rheumatic fever in 1867 left her with a permanent limp, which she bore with the same composed attention she brought to everything else. She named it. She called it the Alexandra limp, with a dry humor that surprised people who expected only dignity from her, and within a year, fashionable London women were affecting a slight limp of their own, as though the princess had simply invented a new way of walking and they intended to follow. This detail about the Alexandra limp is worth staying with for a moment. What it tells you is something about how she managed her life in that world. She could not control whether her husband looked at other women. She could not control what the gossip columns suggested. She could not control what her mother-in-law said about her in letters to the daughters she preferred. But she could take the thing that limited her and name it so precisely and so wryly that the limitation became something else, something almost elegant. She turned disadvantage into information. The women who imitated her limp were telling her, whether they knew it or not, that she was still the one worth following. Alexandra and Bertie had 6 children together. 5 survived to adulthood. The family produced what any observer could see was genuine affection in both directions, a warmth that persisted even through the years when Bertie's extracurricular activities were the talk of every drawing room in London. She was by all surviving accounts a devoted mother, and the children returned the feeling. Her son George, who would become George V, loved her with a directness and intensity that suggested she had given him something his father's world had not, some reliable center to return to. What Alexandra chose not to see, or chose not to discuss, is harder to document because she chose it very carefully. There are surviving letters in which she mentions her husband's friends with a coded brevity that suggests she knew more than she said. There is a letter from the 1890s in which she refers to a specific woman by name and then says nothing further, the way you mention the weather before closing a door. But she was not, as far as anyone can now determine, a woman who spent her evenings weeping. She was a woman who had identified the terms of her situation and decided to live inside them without surrendering any more of herself to them than was strictly required. She had her dogs, she had her children. She had her Danish family, whom she visited regularly and who were, unlike her husband's family, unconditionally glad to see her. She had the British public, who adored her with a particular warmth that contained, transparently, an awareness that she was being treated badly and was being graceful about it, which the British public has always found more admirable than making a fuss. She had, too, a specific kind of knowledge that no other woman in Bertie's world possessed. She was permanent. The mistresses came and went, she stayed. They could be removed eventually, through the natural cooling of affection or the practical pressure of gossip, or the simple arithmetic of time. She could not be removed without dismantling something so large it would take the entire architecture of the British Constitution to accomplish it. She knew this. She used it. She was patient with a patience that is genuinely difficult to distinguish from strength. The first woman to change the terms of that world significantly arrived in London in the spring of 1877. Emily Charlotte Le Breton was born on the 13th of October 1853 at the Old Rectory in St Saviour's Parish on the island of Jersey, the only daughter of the Very Reverend William Courbet Le Breton and his wife Emily. She had 5 brothers and grew up among them with a ease around male company that she would carry through her entire life. Jersey was not London. The rectory had the particular provincial respectability that comes with clerical employment, which is to say that there was not much money and a great deal of emphasis on appearances. Her father was, by various accounts, a man whose relationship with marital fidelity was as uncomplicated as his daughters would later be, though he confined his activities to the Channel Islands rather than the Marlborough House set, and so is largely forgotten. What Lillie Le Breton had from the very beginning was a face that made people stop what they were doing. She was not conventionally pretty in the way that prettiness was understood in the mid-Victorian era, all ringlets and delicacy and pale, careful features. She was something more direct than that. Her beauty had a physical density to it, a presence that the painters and photographers who later spent considerable time trying to capture it generally agreed was not fully reproducible. You had to be in the room with her, or so the accounts suggest. In a room she was a different kind of event. She married Edward Langtry in March of 1874. He was a wealthy Irish widower, heir to a Belfast shipbuilding family, and the marriage was almost certainly a practical decision on both sides. He provided the money and the respectable marriage status that allowed a young woman of limited means to move in London society. She provided the particular luster that a beautiful wife lends to a man who might not otherwise attract much luster. The transaction was not unusual. The Victorian upper middle classes ran on exactly these arrangements. What was unusual was what came next. The Langtrys moved to London in 1875, and within 2 years Lillie had become one of the most famous women in England. This happened through a combination of accidents and calculations so finely balanced that it is still difficult to say which was which. She appeared at a party at Lowndes Square in April of 1877 in a plain black dress, still in mourning for a recently dead brother, with no jewellery, no fashionable gown, nothing to compete with the established hostesses and their carefully assembled spectacles. The artist Frank Miles sketched her that evening, producing work that was later sold on postcards to a public that had not yet met her, and already wanted to. By the time Sir John Everett Millais painted her the following year and titled the portrait A Jersey Lily, the nickname was already attached and would remain. The thing about the Jersey Lily that the postcards and the paintings and the newspaper accounts all struggled to convey was that her beauty was accompanied by a mind quick enough to use it. She was not passive about any of this. She understood what she was, understood what it could do and what it could not do, and she moved through her own celebrity with a deliberateness that looked effortless precisely because she was working at it constantly. On the 24th of May 1877, at a small dinner of 10 people at the house of Sir Alan Young in Stratton Street, Mayfair, Lillie Langtry sat next to the Prince of Wales for the first time. Young was a yachting friend of Bertie's who had asked to have her invited specifically because the prince had expressed interest in meeting her. Bertie had seen the sketches. He was, as Christopher Hibbert's biography later put it, immediately captivated. The full-body turn, the complete attention was directed at Lillie for the rest of the evening. The negotiation that followed was brief. A mutual friend informed Lillie that the prince was much interested in forming a possible friendship. The outcome of the negotiations, an unusual word for the arrangement of a love affair but not inaccurate, was the establishment of a social rule. If the Prince of Wales was attending a party, Lillie Langtry must also be invited. London society accepted this without visible objection. London society did not have visible objections to things the Prince of Wales had decided. They were seen openly in Rotten Row, Hyde Park, riding together at dawn every morning, which was about as private as riding down the centre of Piccadilly but considerably more scenic. Bertie had a house built for Lillie in Bournemouth, a place called the Red House, where the window glass still bears their entwined initials in an etching she made herself, because some gestures are more permanent than their makers intend. He arranged her presentation to Queen Victoria at court, which was either a gesture of extraordinary boldness or an act of such confident casualness that it amounted to the same thing. Victoria received Mrs. Langtry. She reportedly noted, without apparent irony, that Mrs. Langtry was wearing the Prince of Wales feathers in her hair. What did Alexandra make of all this? She made officially nothing of it at all. She met Lillie at various events and was reportedly pleasant to her, not with the strained cordiality of a woman performing normality, but with the particular genuine warmth of someone who has decided to deal with facts rather than emotions about the facts. There is a story that she once said she did not blame the women but could not help sometimes feeling sorry for them, and whether or not the quote is accurate, it has the character of something she might have said. The affair lasted from approximately June of 1877 to June of 1880, 3 years, conducted largely in public, noticed by everyone, discussed in whispers and occasionally in print when editors felt brave enough to test the libel laws. The ending of it, when it came, had the quality of endings in this world, not clean, and not entirely for the reasons that were later reported. Several accounts place the final cooling at a dinner party where Lillie, in a moment of either playfulness or recklessness, poured ice down the prince's collar. The story has survived for 140 years because it feels emotionally true even if the specific ice is difficult to verify. It captures something about the particular dynamic of their relationship, the sense that Lillie was never quite operating inside the rules of the thing, never quite accepting the position the arrangement required her to accept, always pushing slightly past the boundary of what was permitted into the territory of what was interesting. She was too much her own person for the role. This would turn out to be a survival skill. The practical end came when a magazine published a claim that Edward Langtry had named the Prince of Wales as co-respondent in a divorce case. The claim was false, or at least unverifiable, and the magazine's editor was successfully sued for libel, found guilty, and sentenced to 18 months in prison. The damage, however, was done in the way these things always do their damage, not through the fact being established, but through the question being raised publicly enough that everyone was forced to have a position on it. By the time the affair had formally cooled, Lillie was in a precarious position that would have destroyed a woman with less nerve. Her husband, who had been steadily retreating into melancholy and drink since arriving in London, was of no practical use. She had no money of her own, or not enough. She had enormous fame and no reliable means of converting it into income. She was the most recognized woman in England apart from the Queen, and she had no clear future. Bertie, to his credit, did not simply withdraw and leave her to manage. He arranged for her to enter the theatre, in an era when the theatre was not a respectable profession for women of her class, and arranged further for the actor-manager Squire Bancroft to hire her at a salary that made the transition financially viable. He opened Marlborough House to actors and performers, personally legitimizing the association in a way that changed, at least in London's upper circles, how the acting profession was regarded. Lillie became an actress. She turned out to be good enough at it to tour North America multiple times and build a career that outlasted the prince's interest and the scandal and the particular era that had produced all of it. She raced horses under the assumed name Mr. Jersey because the Jockey Club did not permit women members, and one of her horses, Merman, won the Ascot Gold Cup in 1900. She became an American citizen in 1897. She moved to California and bought a vineyard. She opened a theater. She lived until 1929, which meant she outlived the world that had made her famous by about 2 decades, and she spent those years occasionally writing about her past in terms carefully calibrated to be interesting without being ruinous. What she did not write was equally deliberate. She wrote 2 volumes of memoir. They are charming, readable, occasionally sharp, and almost entirely devoid of anything that would have embarrassed the royal family. She mentioned the prince warmly, vaguely, and at a distance of time that made everything sound fond rather than significant. She kept his confidence in the specific sense that confidence required. She never sold the private version of him, never corrected the official record in any way that would have mattered, never made his wife uncomfortable in print. This restraint was not required of her by law at the time she was writing, and the prince had been dead for years. She chose it. Whether she chose it out of genuine affection, or out of a calculation about what would serve her legacy best, or out of a code she had absorbed so thoroughly that violating it would have felt like a violence against her own character, is impossible to determine at this distance. Probably all 3. Probably it was simply who she was by the time she was old enough to write about it. The silence she kept was a kind of last gift, offered freely by a woman who had been given things she could not entirely repay. She had a daughter, born March 8, 1881, named Jane Marie. The paternity of Jane Marie is one of those questions that Victorian record-keeping and social convention collaborated to make permanently uncertain. Lillie told Prince Louis of Battenberg, who was at the time one of the Prince of Wales's naval relatives and also one of Lillie's lovers, that he was the father. Louis was promptly dispatched to sea. Lillie departed for Paris in the company of Arthur Jones, with funding that appears to have come from the Prince of Wales. Jean-Marie was born in Paris. Louis Mountbatten, Prince Louis's son, stated later that he believed his father was the child's biological father. Most historians, examining the timing, find Arthur Jones more probable. The truth was certainly known to Lillie and probably known to no one else, and she took it with her. Jean-Marie was raised at a distance from her mother's fame, and the distance appears to have been mutual. This is one of the things the Code of Silence cost, the clean acknowledgement of ordinary facts. A child who could not openly know her father, a mother who could not openly discuss her child in certain company. The code protected the powerful and it distributed the costs among everyone else. The world these women moved through had rules that were never printed anywhere, which was rather the point. An unwritten rule is harder to challenge and easier to enforce than a written one, because no one can point to it and ask why. The Marlborough House set as the circle around the Prince of Wales was known from the 1860s onward, operated on a set of assumptions so widely shared that they functioned as law. The first assumption was that discretion was not a preference but a requirement. This did not mean concealment exactly. The affairs were known, the newspapers knew, the servants knew, the other members of the set knew with complete certainty who was spending time with whom, and under what circumstances. What discretion meant in practice was that no one said it. No one said it in print if they could be prosecuted for doing so. No one said it at dinner if there were people present who had not already agreed to know it. No one wrote it in letters that might be intercepted or preserved. And absolutely no one said it to anyone who had the power and the inclination to make it official. The second assumption was about access. A woman in Bertie's circle derived a specific set of advantages from the association, depending on how she managed it. There were social advantages. Being known as someone the prince visited meant invitations from hostesses who wanted the prince at their table, and the prince came to tables where people he liked would be. There were sometimes material advantages, though these were handled with a care that bordered on the medical. The Red House at Bournemouth was built for Lillie. Agnes Keyser's hospital was funded with royal patronage. These things were arranged not as payments which would have been vulgar and documented, but as expressions of affection which were personal and deniable. The third assumption was about the wife. Alexandra was not to be disrespected. Not directly, not in the ways that would have forced her to respond. You did not attempt to publicly displace her. You did not appear on his arm in circumstances where the newspapers would describe it in terms that required her husband to issue a correction. You did not behave as though you expected the arrangement to be permanent in a way that competed with the permanence of the marriage. You did not, under any circumstances, make her feel that her home was not her own. This last rule was not about kindness to Alexandra, though some of the women who followed it may have genuinely felt something like kindness. It was about the structural integrity of the whole arrangement. The system worked because it maintained the wife's dignity sufficiently that she had no cause to dismantle it, break the rule, threaten the wife's standing, and the wife had grounds to act. Alexandra had enormous grounds for action on a theoretical level. She had every right to make a scene, appeal to her mother-in-law, demand intervention from ministers, create any number of complications. She chose not to use any of those grounds, but she could only maintain that choice as long as the women around her husband maintained their side of the compact. The architecture that held all of this together was physical as much as social. The country house weekend was the primary mechanism. Bertie travelled constantly among the great estates of the British aristocracy, and the hosts who invited him understood that certain guests would be included in the party. The guests who were included understood that certain rooms would be allocated in certain ways, and that the house's servants would pretend to know nothing while knowing everything. This required the cooperation of dozens of people, and it worked, most of the time because everyone in the system had an interest in the system continuing to function. The servants were perhaps the most important part of this. A footman who saw something was expected to have not seen it. A lady's maid who knew whose hairpins were in the wrong room at breakfast was expected to have found them elsewhere. The housekeeper who managed the room assignments understood which guests were to be given rooms with connecting corridors and which were to be given rooms with locked doors. This knowledge was not compensated with bonuses. It was compensated with employment, with the understanding that a servant who talked was a servant who was dismissed without a character reference, and a servant dismissed without a character reference could not find another position in a house of similar standing. The economics of silence were very clear. If you are watching this for the first time, subscribe now and hit the bell so you never miss a video like this. We cover the hidden histories of the British royal family every week, and the story of the women around Edward VII is only just beginning. There is a great deal more to cover, and none of it is in the official record. Rosa Lewis understood these economics better than almost anyone. Lewis was born in Essex in 1867, the daughter of a clockmaker. She entered domestic service as a child, which was not unusual, and spent her early career learning to cook at a level of skill that was genuinely extraordinary. By the time she came to Bertie's attention, she had established a reputation as a cook of the first order, someone who could produce a cold game supper for 40 people at 3 in the morning as though she had expected the request all evening. which she usually had because she was very good at anticipating what Bertie's evenings required. She eventually ran the Cavendish Hotel on Jermyn Street, which became the particular address for the people who needed somewhere discreet to be. It was not a brothel. It was a hotel where certain people stayed and certain arrangements were made, and the staff were not observed to observe anything. Lewis served at Edward's court in various capacities for decades. She outlived the Edwardian era by 4 decades and gave interviews in her very old age that were entertaining, warm, occasionally sharp, and almost entirely devoid of specific names or incidents. She had internalized the code so completely that she deployed it even when no one could have punished her for abandoning it. She was once asked in her 90s whether she had known King Edward VII. She said she had known him very well, that he had been the most charming man she had ever met, and that she intended to keep it at that. The code had been tested before, several times. Each test left a mark on the way the system understood itself. In 1869, a young woman named Harriet Moncrieff married Sir Charles Mordaunt, a member of Parliament and one of the Prince's hunting companions. She was in her early 20s, high-spirited and connected through her husband to the Marlborough House set. She had admirers. She had, by her own later admission and possibly her own later confusion, more than admirers. The birth of her first child in 1869 was complicated. The infant was feared to be going blind. Whether from genuine collapse or genuine guilt, Harriet went to her husband and told him that she had been unfaithful multiple times, with multiple men. One of them was the Prince of Wales. Sir Charles Mordaunt filed for divorce. The lawyers became involved. Among the men Harriet had named was Viscount Cole, Sir Frederick Johnston, and the Prince of Wales. The prince was eventually not named as a formal co-respondent in the divorce petition, but he was summoned to appear as a witness. He appeared, February of 1870. He was examined for 7 minutes. He denied anything improper between himself and Lady Mordaunt, with a single, flat, never. Sir Charles's counsel did not cross-examine him. Whether the legal courtesy extended to the prince was simply habitual deference or something more deliberate in its arrangement is a question the records do not answer. The public reaction was not as forgiving as the legal process. Crowds turned out to watch the prince enter and leave the court. The newspapers that were willing to push the topic pushed it. Queen Victoria received letters from anxious correspondents questioning whether the heir to the throne was fit for the position. Reynolds' newspaper asked publicly whether the Queen's successor possessed the tact and talent to keep royalty on its legs and out of the gutter. This was not a small thing. The British monarchy in the 1870s was not the settled institution it would become. There were vocal Republican movements. There were politicians willing to make arguments in Parliament about the cost and worth of the royal family. The prince's reputation at this moment was a genuine political variable, and everyone who managed that reputation knew it. Harriet Mordaunt, meanwhile, had been declared legally insane. Her own family, with several other daughters still to be married, found it convenient to make this declaration early and thoroughly. She was committed to a series of private houses and then asylums. She spent the remaining 36 years of her life in institutions, dying in 1906. Sir Charles Mordaunt got his divorce eventually in 1875, when Viscount Cole admitted paternity of the child and the insanity defense was overcome. The question of what Harriet Mordaunt actually knew, and what she actually said, and what she would have said if she had retained both her freedom and her credibility, is one of those questions the archive cannot answer. Alexandra's response to the Mordaunt case was the same one she deployed for most things. She appeared in public, accepted the sympathetic cheers of crowds who understood the situation without anyone explaining it, and said nothing for the record. What she said in private is not known. The Beresford affair, which came later, was different in character and considerably more difficult to resolve. In 1890, Bertie was in a deep attachment to Daisy Greville, who was in the process of ending her affair with Lord Charles Beresford. Daisy wrote a letter to Lady Beresford explaining that the attachment with her husband was over. Lady Beresford intercepted or received the letter depending on which account you prefer. She kept it. She recognized its value immediately. The letter detailed things that, if made public, would embarrass the Prince of Wales through his association with Daisy, and would involve the Beresfords in a scandal that would destroy them all equally. Bertie attempted to retrieve the letter. Lady Beresford refused to return it. Lord Charles Beresford became involved, defending his wife's position. The dispute escalated into an extended, ugly quarrel that lasted years and left the Beresfords effectively exiled from the prince's circle, which in this world was a form of social death. Lord Salisbury, then Prime Minister, eventually had to intervene to reach some form of agreement. The letter was apparently destroyed, though what Lady Beresford received in exchange for destroying it is not entirely clear from the surviving records. What the Beresford affair demonstrated was the specific vulnerability in the system. The code of silence worked as long as everyone inside it agreed to maintain it. The moment someone decided the code was less valuable than whatever they could extract by threatening to violate it, the whole architecture trembled. Lady Beresford had leverage and she used it, not to publish anything but to make her displeasure cost something. The distinction between that and blackmail was technically significant and practically thin. The Beresfords were eventually allowed back into a reduced version of the prince's social circle, which was less a resolution than a management of ongoing hostility. Lord Charles Beresford reportedly remained angry for the rest of his life about how the episode had ended, and made statements in later years that suggested the anger had not mellowed with time. In this he was unusual. Most of the people who knew Bertie's secrets took them to their graves without anyone having to pay them for the privilege. Daisy Warwick, who had been the cause of the Beresford affair, would eventually test the system much more directly, but she was not finished with the prince yet. Their affair, which had begun in the middle of the letter dispute, would last another 9 years, and during those 9 years she was the most prominent woman in his life. She was also changing. She was becoming something the system had not quite anticipated. Frances Evelyn Maynard was born on the 10th of December, 1861, at Easton Lodge near Great Dunmow in Essex. She was one of 3 children of the Honourable Charles Maynard, who died 3 months after Daisy's birth. Her mother then married Lord Rosslyn, a courtier of Queen Victoria, giving Daisy a stepfather of exactly the right social calibration, and half-sisters who would go on to become some of the most prominent women of the Edwardian era. Her half-sister Millicent married the Duke of Sutherland. Her half-sister Sybil married the Earl of Westmoreland. The family produced female excellence as a matter of routine. Daisy herself inherited, at the age of 3, the estates of her grandfather the Viscount Maynard. She was, from childhood, extremely rich in a way that would matter later because she spent the money before she understood its limits. She was also, by the time she reached her 20s, one of the most beautiful women in England, and she had been told this often enough and by enough people whose opinion was considered reliable that she had organized her life around the fact without perhaps quite realizing she had done so. She married the Earl of Warwick in 1881, becoming the Countess of Warwick. She had 5 children, though only the first was certainly her husband's, which was not particularly unusual for a woman moving in the circles she moved in, and she was not the kind of person to find this distressing. She had an affair with Lord Charles Beresford. She ended it. She wrote the letter that triggered the entire episode, and somewhere in the management of the subsequent disaster, she ended up in proximity to the Prince of Wales in a way that allowed the attraction between them, which had apparently been there for some time, to become something actual. The affair between Daisy Warwick and the Prince of Wales began around 1890 and lasted until 1898. 9 years, longer than Lillie Langtry by 6 years, longer than most. During those 9 years, Daisy was the most publicly visible of the prince's attachments. She was brilliant, politically opinionated, socially fearless, and about as good at the required discretion as a person could be who was also constitutionally incapable of not having opinions loudly and at length. She was observed to arrive at and depart from houses where the prince was staying at hours that left no ambiguity about her purpose. She was known, throughout London society, as the woman the prince currently favoured. She showed off the position in ways that annoyed Alexandra intensely. Alexandra, who had been reasonably philosophical about Lillie Langtry, found Daisy considerably harder. Daisy did not follow the rule about the wife. She appeared to enjoy her prominence in ways that pressed directly on Alexandra's dignity in a way that Lillie, for all her other qualities, had been careful to avoid. Alexandra's complaint about Daisy in the surviving record is not about the affair itself, but about the conduct of it. The Duchess of Sutherland, Daisy's own half-sister, reportedly said at some point during this period that the prince was a much pleasanter man now that he had changed his mistresses, suggesting that the difficulty of the Daisy years was widely acknowledged even within Daisy's own family. Then, around 1896, something happened to Daisy that changed her. Robert Blatchford was a journalist and socialist activist who had written a critique of Daisy's lifestyle, specifically of the excess and conspicuous waste of the Edwardian aristocratic world that she inhabited and embodied. He published it. Daisy read it. She could have ignored it or been offended by it in the usual way. Instead, she sought him out and asked him to explain his argument to her. This is a remarkable thing to do. It is remarkable partly because she was not required to do it and nobody expected her to, and partly because of what came from it. Blatchford made his argument, and Daisy, who was not stupid and who had perhaps been growing bored with a world that offered her everything except something to push against, found the argument persuasive. She joined the Social Democratic Federation in 1904. She began donating large amounts of money to causes the Federation supported. She established a college for women's education in agriculture and market gardening, first in Reading and then in Studley. She funded a needlework school and employment scheme in Essex. She appointed socialist clergy to the livings in parishes under her patronage. She became, in short, a socialist countess, which was the kind of contradiction that the Edwardian era was uniquely able to produce, and that provided considerable entertainment for political cartoonists on multiple sides of the argument. The Prince of Wales, who had become King Edward VII in 1901, was not alive to see the full development of Daisy's political transformation. He died in May of 1910. Daisy had been out of his romantic life for 12 years by then, but she was not out of his letters. During the 9 years of their affair, he had written to her, regularly, warmly, in the specific idiom of a man who did not find letters easy and nevertheless sat down to write them because the alternative was worse. The letters said things that letters written by a prince to his mistress are likely to say, and also things that were more specific to this particular prince and this particular mistress, references to current events, opinions about politicians, observations about the world that he could share with her in ways he could not share them in official correspondence. She had kept all of them. After the king died, Daisy was in debt. This was not new. She had been in debt for years, spending her way through the inheritance with a thoroughness that even she eventually recognized as a problem. By 1913 or 1914, the debt was beyond her capacity to manage through the usual means. She needed a very large amount of money. She approached the publisher Frank Harris with the letters. Harris was exactly the wrong person to approach for discreet handling of sensitive material, being a man who had built his reputation on a combination of literary skill and a total absence of scruple, but he was willing to discuss publication. The plan was to sell the letters and publish them in such a way that would generate income for Daisy and a story for Harris and, inevitably, a catastrophe for the royal family. The royal family found out, or more precisely Lord Stamfordham, who was private secretary first to Queen Victoria and then to George V, and who managed the relationship between the monarch and the world with a professional thoroughness that was itself a kind of heroism, found out. Stamfordham presented a legal argument. The copyright of the letters belonged to the king who had written them, which meant it now belonged to King George V, and Daisy had no legal right to publish them in Britain. The High Court agreed. Daisy was restrained from publishing the letters in the United Kingdom. She threatened to sell them to American media. There was no equivalent legal mechanism in the United States that would have prevented it, and Harris had American contacts. The prospect was real, and the damage it would cause was real. These were letters that proved adultery by the previous king, letters that were politically and personally embarrassing, letters that would have reopened every wound the Edwardian establishment had spent decades managing. Arthur de Cross was a wealthy British industrialist and politician who had, for reasons that are not entirely documented, come to function as a kind of financial intermediary between Daisy and her creditors. He offered to pay £64,000 worth of Daisy's debts in exchange for the letters. The equivalent in 21st century terms is several £1,000,000. Ducrot was made a baronet in 1916. The connection between these two events is not stated in the official record but has not required much inference to establish. Daisy handed over the letters disappeared. Daisy did eventually publish memoirs in the 1920s and later, but they were heavily managed, submitted in advance to what she called a literary man for review, and they contain the careful vagueness of documents that have been reviewed by someone whose job was to remove the dangerous parts. What was in those letters that was worth £64,000? £100,000? That question has no clean answer because the letters themselves are not available for examination. What is known is that they confirmed the affairs in terms that could not be explained away, and that they contained political opinions that Edward VII had shared with Daisy, and that in some cases ran contrary to official positions he had taken. The combination of personal embarrassment and political sensitivity made them worth every pound. Daisy lived until 1938. She wrote 12 books. She ran for Parliament as a Labour candidate in 1923 and was not elected. She funded social projects and educational schemes, and made speeches about the working conditions of women with a genuine passion that none of her critics found entirely credible, but none of her supporters could entirely dismiss. She was buried at Easton Lodge, in the Essex she had inherited as a 3-year-old heiress, and spent 6 decades making interesting. The woman who finally understood the rules so completely that she made them look effortless arrived in the prince's life in early 1898. Alice Frederica Edmonstone was born on the 29th of April, 1868, at Woolwich in Kent, though her family seat was Duntreath Castle in Stirlingshire, Scotland. Her father was Sir William Edmonstone, 4th Baronet. Her mother was Mary Elizabeth Parsons. She grew up in Scotland with the particular combination of informality and confidence that Scottish aristocratic upbringings often produce, a quality quite different from the English upper-class formality of, say, the Marlborough House set, and which would prove very useful. She made her debut in London society in 1886 and was, by all accounts, immediately noticed. She had brown hair, blue eyes, a small waist, and what contemporaries described in the specific elevated vocabulary of the era as a magnificent figure, which meant she was built on generous lines and was entirely comfortable in her body, which combination was considered extremely attractive. She was also, and this mattered more in the long run, extremely good at conversation. Not just charming in the pleasant, frictionless way that certain women learn to be charming, she was genuinely interesting to talk to. She had read things and thought about them and had opinions that were not simply reflections of whoever she was speaking with. In 1888 she married George Keppel, a soldier who had served with the Gordon Highlanders and the Norfolk Artillery. George Keppel was a handsome man with a pleasant manner, a talent for making himself agreeable in any company, and a degree of equanimity about his wife's subsequent activities that has impressed and puzzled historians ever since. They had 2 daughters together, Violet, born in 1894, and Sonia, born in 1900. The nature of George Keppel's arrangement with his wife is one of those questions that the surviving sources are just barely willing to illuminate. He knew about the relationship with the Prince of Wales. He could not have not known. The relationship was, by the standards of Edwardian discretion, reasonably public. George appears to have accepted it with the same equanimity he brought to most things, which some accounts explain as the pragmatism of a man who knew he was living better than his income would otherwise have allowed, and which other accounts explain as simply who George was. One of their daughters wrote later that theirs was a marriage of companionship, of love and laughter, and the phrasing suggests that whatever else the Keppel marriage was, it was not merely a performance of normality. Alice met the Prince of Wales in early 1898. She was 29, he was 56. Within weeks the arrangement was established. What Alice brought to the position that neither Lillie Langtry nor Daisy Warwick had quite managed was a combination of qualities that worked together in a specific way. She was beautiful enough to keep the prince's sustained attention. She was intelligent enough to provide him with something beyond beauty. She was politically informed enough to be genuinely useful to him. Ministers and diplomats who needed to reach the prince when official channels were too slow or too formal found in Alice a reliable back channel who understood what was being asked and could manage the transmission without creating new problems. She was discreet in the specific way the code required, which is to say not absent or invisible but careful. She appeared in society, she hosted dinners, she was seen, but she managed where she was seen and what was said about it with a precision that Daisy had never quite achieved. And she was, by all surviving accounts, kind to Alexandra. This last quality is the most interesting and the most difficult to fully explain. Alexandra preferred Alice to Daisy. This preference was documented, commented on at the time, and appears to have been genuine. The Duchess of Sutherland's remark about the prince being pleasanter since changing mistresses was not only about his mood, it was about the domestic temperature of the whole arrangement. Daisy's behavior had made Alexandra's situation uncomfortable in ways that impinged directly on her dignity. Alice's behavior, by contrast, seems to have maintained the structure of the situation without making it worse than it had to be. Whether this was kindness or calculation is again a question the sources decline to fully resolve. Perhaps it was neither. Perhaps it was simply that Alice was better at reading rooms than Daisy was, better at knowing which things could be done and which things could not, better at the continuous management of multiple relationships that the position required. Daisy was brilliant and charismatic and too large for the space the arrangement allowed. Alice fit the space precisely and seemed to understand that fitting it was the point. Alexandra was quoted at some point during these years as being grateful that Alice kept the prince in a good mood. Whether gratitude is the exact right word for what she felt is debatable, but it suggests that the relationship between wife and mistress was something other than simply adversarial, and that is unusual enough to be worth noting. The Keppel household became a significant node in Edwardian society. Alice hosted dinners at her house in Portman Square that were attended by the great figures of the era: politicians, diplomats, financiers, writers, artists. The prince attended frequently, and so therefore did everyone who wanted to be in the room when the prince was. Alice managed these evenings with the skill of a professional, which is not quite what she was but is close to what she had become. Her daughter Violet, born 1894, was growing up in this world and absorbing it with the specific intensity of a child who is paying close attention. Violet would grow into one of the most turbulent figures of the next generation, conducting a passionate and damaging love affair with Vita Sackville-West that stretched from their teenage years well into adulthood and caused both families enormous distress. The parallels between Violet's chosen form of love, which was impossible and public and refused to be managed, and Alice's chosen form, which was possible and managed and appeared perfectly normal, are not subtle. Whether Alice saw those parallels, and what she thought of them if she did, was not recorded. Her younger daughter Sonia was born in 1900, while the affair with the prince was ongoing. Sonia later wrote a memoir, published in 1958, called Edwardian Daughter, which is one of the most graceful pieces of discretion in the literature on the period. She wrote about her childhood with warmth and specificity, and a deliberate lack of explicitness about the central fact that any reader of her book already knew. She remembered the prince with genuine affection, as one remembers a significant figure from childhood who was always kind and whose specific role was never quite explained. She wrote about her mother with a love that was also a kind of tribute, not to what Alice had done but to who she had been while doing it. Sonia Keppel married Roland Cubitt and had children. One of those children was Rosalind. Rosalind married Major Bruce Shand. Their daughter was born on July 17, 1947. Her name was Camilla. The connection between Alice Keppel and Camilla Parker Bowles, who would become Queen Consort of the United Kingdom in 2023, is the most remarked upon biographical coincidence in modern British royal history. It is also, when examined carefully, something more than a coincidence. Camilla Shand grew up knowing who her great-grandmother was. The Keppels were not a family that hid their history. Sonia's memoir existed. The stories were told. The figure of Alice, beautiful and assured and perfectly positioned, was present in Camilla's family background as both a fact and an implicit lesson. When Camilla Shand met Prince Charles at a polo match in the early 1970s, she is reported to have introduced herself with a line that has since been retold so many times that it is impossible to verify in its exact wording, but which has the character of something a woman from this family, in this era, might very well have said. The version that has survived most reliably goes roughly: "My great-grandmother was the mistress of your great-great-grandfather. Perhaps we have something in common." Whether or not the line was delivered exactly as reported, and whether or not it was intended as flirtation or as warning or as both, it describes a relationship to history that is not incidental. Camilla came from a family that had managed the specific difficulty of a relationship with a prince, had managed it well, and had survived it into subsequent generations without disgrace. She knew the shape of the thing before she stepped inside it. She also eventually broke from the pattern in the most significant way. She married the prince. Alice had never married Edward, could not have married Edward, and the suggestion that she might have wanted to is probably anachronistic. The world of 1995 was different from the world of 1900 in ways that made the outcome possible that would have been impossible earlier. Charles divorced Diana in 1996. Camilla divorced Andrew Parker Bowles the same year. They married in 2005. Alice Keppel, watching the abdication crisis of 1936 from her villa in Florence, is reported to have said, "Things were done much better in my day." The remark has been quoted countless times, usually as evidence of her amusement at the incompetence of Wallis Simpson and Edward VIII, or as evidence of her arrogance, or as simple nostalgia for the world she had inhabited and managed so well. It contains all of these, probably. But it also contains something more specific, a professional judgment from a woman who had understood the requirements of the position and met them, regarding people who had failed to understand those requirements or had understood them and refused to meet them. The requirement she was evaluating was not complicated in theory. You could love a king, you could be loved by a king, you could be his companion, his confidante, his preferred presence, the person he most wanted in the room. You could do all of this and the system could tolerate it and even in its specific way accommodate it, as long as certain things remained stable. The marriage had to remain intact, at least publicly. The wife's dignity had to be protected, at least formally. The arrangement had to stop short of the point where it forced a public reckoning that the system could not manage. Wallis Simpson and Edward VIII did not stop short of that point. They went past it at full speed, tearing a hole in the fabric of what the institution had spent 2 centuries patching and maintaining, and the result was a constitutional crisis that ended in an abdication speech broadcast on the radio and heard by 50 million people. Alice's remark was not primarily about Wallis Simpson. It was about Edward VIII, a man who had refused to manage the thing the way it needed to be managed, who had treated the monarchy as a vehicle for personal feeling rather than as an institution with specific requirements. A man who had, in Alice's view, failed at exactly the thing that the men and women of her era had learned, through long practice, to do successfully. There is an argument, which some historians have made and which has some merit, that the Edwardian arrangement, the system of managed affairs and maintained silences, was not a humane way to organize the lives of the people inside it. The argument runs that it required women to subordinate their own needs and feelings to the requirements of a system they had not designed and could not change, that it made Alexandra's dignity dependent on the goodwill of women who had no particular obligation to her, and that the costs of the system were distributed very unevenly, falling mostly on the women while the man at the center moved through the whole arrangement with relatively limited consequences. This argument is correct. It is also somewhat ahistorical, in the sense that applying 21st century frameworks to 19th century arrangements produces conclusions that are accurate about the arrangement's limitations without quite illuminating how the people inside it understood themselves. The women around Edward VII were not, in the main, passive participants in a system that imposed itself on them from above. They were active agents who chose with varying degrees of awareness and calculation to enter and maintain particular positions in a world that offered them specific things in exchange for specific costs. Lillie Langtry chose the prince's attention and the career it enabled. Daisy Warwick chose the influence and the prominent position and ultimately chose the money over the code, or tried to. Agnes Keyser chose the quiet companionship and the hospital. Alice Keppel chose everything: the relationship, the social position, the management of it, and the eventual silence. What none of them chose was the particular way the system would treat their choices after the fact. Lily's daughter growing up estranged, Harriet Mordaunt spending 36 years in an asylum, Daisy's letters traded for cash like any other commodity, Alice being dragged from a deathbed by royal command. The system protected the man at the center and allocated the consequences outward. This was not an accident. Alexandra of Denmark died on the 20th of November 1925. She was 80. She had survived her husband by 15 years, spending them as Queen Mother in the particular complicated position of a woman whose official purpose had been accomplished and who was now simply present, respected and loved, and somewhat to the side of the main action. She moved back to Sandringham, which had been her home during the long years of waiting for Edward to be king, and which she had always preferred to Buckingham Palace. She kept her dogs and her family nearby. She deteriorated slowly, her deafness becoming total, her health becoming fragile, and she retained her characteristic composed attention until near the end. In the months after her husband's death, she had done something that the archivists and biographers who came later have reason to regret. She burned letters, a very large number of letters she had written and letters she had received, decades of correspondence that documented a private life she had never fully shared with anyone. What was in those letters is not known, which is precisely what she intended. This was her final exercise of the code. She had kept silent for 50 years about her husband's affairs, and the women who conducted them had maintained her dignity and composure through Lillie and Daisy and Alice and all the lesser-known figures the historians are still finding. At the end, she ensured that what little of her private response had been committed to writing would not be available for examination. She gave the world her official self and kept the private version. In this, she was the most complete adherent to the code of any of them. Agnes Keyser does not appear in most general accounts of Edward VII's women because she preferred it that way, which was consistent with her general preference throughout her life. She was born in 1852, the daughter of a wealthy stockbroker, and she never married. She moved in the upper reaches of London society with the particular freedom of a wealthy, intelligent, unmarried woman who had decided what mattered to her and was pursuing it without the requirement to explain herself to anyone. She came into Bertie's life at some point in the 1890s, probably around the same time as Alice Keppel, though the relationship had a different character. Where Alice's position was partly social and partly political, Agnes's was more private. She provided company of a specifically quiet kind, the kind that a man in Bertie's position, surrounded by noise and performance at every public moment, might find genuinely restorative. Friendship sustained over years without the particular pressures of a more openly acknowledged attachment. Bertie and Lord Randolph did not speak for years afterward. The prince essentially required all of his social circle to exclude the Churchills, which was a very effective form of social destruction in a context where the prince's circle was the world that mattered. Then, somewhere in the mid-1880s, the enmity softened and the Churchills were admitted back. This was Bertie's call to make, and he made it, and the reason he made it is not fully documented. Jenny Churchill was brilliant and beautiful and had been generous with her company and her confidence. Whatever the specific character of their relationship, it had a warmth that persisted through the years of difficulty and came out the other side still intact. She survived her husband, who died in 1895, and went on to have 2 more marriages and a long, active, useful life before her death in 1921. She did not write about her friendship with the prince in the specific way that would have satisfied the curious, which again was consistent with the requirements of the world she had inhabited. The women whose names are not in this account also need a paragraph, because they existed and their existence shaped the world even if the record has not preserved their particular names. The Edwardian era was not short of women who moved in and out of Bertie's orbit in ways that were noticed at the time and then managed out of the official record. Country house parties involving 50 or 60 guests produced corridors of association that the formal documentation was designed to make invisible. The women who assisted at those parties, who arranged the rooms and managed the guest lists and understood which invitations were actually instructions, existed in the record as servants or as hostesses, not as participants. There were women in the theatrical world beyond Lillie Langtry. Sarah Bernhardt, the great French actress, was someone to whom Bertie was devoted, and whose company he sought with a frequency that London society noticed. Hortense Schneider, the French opera singer he had known in Paris in earlier years, was part of the Parisian circle that functioned as a separate and somewhat less carefully managed version of the London operation. The French arrangements were generally conducted with a privacy the British press observed less closely, partly because of geography and partly because Paris had its own conventions about these matters. What all of these women shared was not beauty, though most were beautiful, and not intelligence, though many were exceptionally intelligent. What they shared was the specific quality of knowing how to be a particular kind of presence in a particular kind of room. To be there when wanted and absent when not wanted, to know the difference between those two states without being told, to accept the terms and the costs and the constraints not because they were required to by someone holding direct power over them, but because they had assessed the situation and decided that what was on offer was worth what it cost. Some of them were right about this calculation. Some of them were not. The difference between the two groups had less to do with the terms on offer than with what they had brought into the arrangement with them and what they needed to protect. The women who managed the system best were the ones who had something else. Lillie had her nerve and her intelligence and eventually her career. Alice had her family and her social position and, perhaps most significantly in practical terms, a husband whose accommodation of the situation was real rather than performed. Daisy had her politics, her causes, her enormous energy, and in the end she had her need for money, which turned out to be a more powerful force than the code. Agnes had her hospital. Alexandra had her children, her family, and the permanent status that nothing could remove. The women who managed it least well were the ones who had nothing outside the arrangement. Harriet Mordaunt had only her position as a baronet's wife and her own youth, and both of those were used against her. This, when examined at sufficient distance, is the mechanism of the Code of Silence. It was not primarily about protecting Edward VII, though it did that as a side effect. It was primarily about maintaining a world in which certain things could happen without the formal acknowledgement that would require institutional response. The world of the Marlborough House set was built on the premise that private behavior and public accountability were separable, that a man could be one thing in private and another thing in public, and that both things could be real simultaneously. The women around him were the infrastructure of that separation. They made it possible, they maintained it, some of them paid for it, most of them kept the terms. The spring of 1910 was the beginning of the end of that world, though nobody inside it knew that specifically. Edward VII had been king for 9 years by then. He had become, to the astonishment of almost everyone who had spent the previous 4 decades watching him, a genuinely effective monarch. The diplomatic skills he had developed in those decades of enforced idleness, the ability to enter a room and make the most important person in it feel that they were being understood rather than managed, turned out to be exactly the skills a constitutional monarch needed in the specific political landscape of the early 20th century. He moved through the courts of Europe with a grace that no amount of training could have produced, and that his 60 years of practicing it had made second nature. He brokered relationships between countries whose governments were moving, with mounting speed, toward the configurations that would produce the First World War. Whether his life had extended longer, and whether the relationships he maintained could have altered the course of the next decade, is a question that history declined to answer by keeping him alive long enough to test it. He had been coughing through the winter. He traveled to France in March of 1910, as he often did in spring, but the trip was not restorative. He was unwell in a way that his characteristic refusal to acknowledge physical limitation could not fully conceal. He returned to Buckingham Palace at the end of April, suffering from severe bronchitis. Alexandra was in Corfu, visiting her brother. She was called back. In the first days of May, he was declining in a way that everyone around him could see. He continued to insist on working, continued to refuse to lie down, continued to see people and receive his papers and behave as though the body's vote on the subject was simply irrelevant. On May 6th, he suffered several heart attacks. Between moments of loss of consciousness, he was still refusing to take to his bed, still saying he would go on, he would work to the end. Alice Keppel had come to London. She had been at the palace, or trying to reach the palace, or positioned at a distance from the palace that the circumstances had determined to be appropriate, for days. The specific choreography of where she was and when, during those first days of May, is one of those details that the surviving accounts manage in slightly different ways. She was in London. She was aware of what was happening. She was not permitted to be where she most wanted to be. She showed to Alexandra a letter that Bertie had written in 1902. The exact wording of the letter is not preserved in the accessible record, but its substance is clear from what happened afterward. It was a letter in which Edward had specified that he wanted Alice by his side at the end. Alexandra looked at the letter. Alexandra, who had maintained her dignity and her silence and her particular form of grace through 47 years of marriage and 9 years of Alice Keppel's particular prominence in her husband's life, made a decision that must have cost her a very great deal. She allowed Alice into the room. What happened inside that room is assembled from fragments. Bertie was still conscious, briefly. He was brought news that his horse, Witch of the Air, had won at Kempton Park that afternoon, and he managed to say that he was very glad. He appeared to recognize Alice. There is a widely repeated account in which he turned to his wife and commended Alice to her, in language that various sources have rendered slightly differently but which amounts to an instruction to take care of the woman who had taken care of him. Whether he then kissed Alice's hand, as some accounts have it, or simply held it, or simply looked at her, the surviving accounts do not agree. What they agree on is that soon after this the king lost consciousness. Alexandra said, "Get that woman away." Alice Keppel was not composed when they removed her from the room. Whatever she had been in that world for 11 years, whatever grace and intelligence and careful management she had deployed through 11 years of being precisely what the situation required, it left her entirely when the door closed between her and the man she had loved. She was heard by witnesses who later said they had not been listening but remembered it clearly, crying out that there had been nothing wrong, that she had never done anything to be ashamed of. This may have been genuine distress speaking without the filter she usually kept in place. It may have been something more specifically directed at Alexandra, a last-moment attempt to establish the terms of the relationship for the record, for whatever that was worth. Or it may have been simply what a person says when they have spent years being perfectly restrained, and the thing that required the restraint is over. She was helped out of the room and into a corridor. The king died that evening at 11:45, with Alexandra and his son George by his side. Alice Keppel was permitted to attend the funeral. She attended through a side entrance. This detail has been repeated many times in accounts of the period because it is vivid and because it is accurate in the specific way that accurate details often are, which is to say it captures in a single physical fact the essential truth of the whole arrangement, included but not included, present but not present, acknowledged by the ceremony and excluded from the ceremony simultaneously. The code observed to the last. Alexandra died 15 years later and burned her letters before she went. What remained of that world after May of 1910 was the institution and the memory and the inheritance. The institution continued, modified by time and by the specific character of the people who came after. George V was nothing like his father in the particular ways that mattered to this story. He was faithful to his wife in a way his father had not been, genuinely uncomfortable with the kind of social informality that the Marlborough House set had operated on, and committed to a version of monarchy that was more visibly domestic and less visibly pleasure-seeking. The era of the great country house party, the architectural infrastructure of the Victorian and Edwardian affair, was already being dismantled by the economics of the First World War. The memory lived on in books and in conversations and in the specific form in which it was transmitted within certain families. Sonia Keppel wrote her memoir in the late 1950s and published it in 1958. She was 58 years old. She had spent her entire life carrying the knowledge of what her mother had been to the king, and what it meant, and how it had organized the world she grew up in. The book she wrote is gentle and warm and slightly protective of almost everything it discusses, which is the characteristic mode of that generation's memoir writing. She remembered the man she had known as a child as someone who was simply kind to her. She remembered her mother as someone who was everything that world required her to be. She wrote about it, she wrote carefully, she gave enough to be honest and kept enough to honor the code she had grown up inside. The inheritance in the most literal sense came through Sonia to her daughter Rosalind, to Rosalind's daughter Camilla, who was born in 1947 and grew up in a family that had a specific relationship to this history. When the relationship between Prince Charles and Camilla Parker Bowles became public knowledge, in the years during and after the marriage to Diana, the connection to Alice Keppel was one of the first things many journalists reached for. The great-grandmother, the great-granddaughter, the repeating pattern. The connection was real and the observation was valid, and it was made so many times that Camilla eventually had to simply acknowledge it as a fact about her family and then move past it. There were differences between Alice's situation and Camilla's that are at least as significant as the similarities. Alice and Edward VII operated inside an arrangement where the code of silence worked because the institutions that transmitted information, the press, the legal system, the networks of social obligation, could be managed. Camilla and Charles operated inside an arrangement where those institutions had lost the capacity or the will to be managed, where a photograph taken from a distance by a person with a long lens could appear on every front page by morning, where a phone conversation recorded by an amateur enthusiast with a scanner could be transcribed and published, where a princess could go on television and say things that no one in Alice Keppel's world would ever have said, and the system had no mechanism to prevent any of it. Diana Spencer did not keep the code. She wrote notes, she gave interviews, she published. She appeared on Panorama in November of 1995 and told the specific truth about what her marriage had been, speaking with a directness and a visible anguish that made 60 million people feel they were being told something true. Whether they were right about the truth and how much of the truth and which parts were more complicated than they appeared is a different discussion. What matters here is the act. A woman in the position that Alice Keppel had understood so precisely, breaking the code in the most public and irreversible way available to her. Alice Keppel would not have done it. This is not a criticism of Diana, and it is not entirely a compliment to Alice. It is a statement about the different worlds they inhabited and the different options those worlds offered. There is a photograph that exists somewhere in the archive of the early 1900s, which various biographers have described without being entirely able to produce a copy. It shows Alice Keppel in a drawing room, dressed in the particular elaborate way that well-dressed Edwardian women dressed, surrounded by the particular expensive furniture that Edwardian drawing rooms contained. She is looking at the camera with an expression that most describers have called composed, and which some have called something slightly harder than composed, and which one biographer called the expression of a woman who knows exactly what is going to happen next. Whether this photograph exists in the form described, or whether the description has accumulated details over decades of retelling, it captures something true about Alice Keppel. She knew what was going to happen next because she had understood the world she was in well enough to predict it. She had been presented with a specific set of terms, and she had accepted them, and she had lived out the implications of accepting them with a consistency and an intelligence that the world she inhabited found admirable. The things she did not allow herself to feel, or did not allow herself to show, are not in the record. They were never supposed to be. They were never supposed to be spoken about, which is what the title of this account says, and which was the central requirement of everything described in it. The women around King Edward VII were never supposed to speak about it. Most of them did not. Alexandra, who had the most to say, burned her letters and took her silence with her. Lillie, who had the most to gain from speaking, wrote charming memoirs that said almost nothing. Agnes Keyser left no memoir at all and founded a hospital instead. Daisy Warwick tried to speak at a very high price and found the courts and the treasury and the whole weight of the institution arranged against her until someone bought her silence at £64,000. Alice Keppel said things were done better in her day and kept the rest. Harriet Mordaunt spoke at the worst possible moment, in the worst possible state, to the worst possible audience, and spent the rest of her life in institutions for it. The asymmetry here is the point. The system did not simply require silence, it required silence from certain people and made it available to others. The man at the center of it all, the man who had spent 60 years waiting for a job and filled the waiting with everything his parents had forbidden him, did not keep silence. He wrote letters, he commissioned love nests, he built a room in a Parisian brothel, he brought a mistress to a house party where his wife was present and allowed the whole of London society to see the arrangement. He lived visibly and largely and without the particular discipline that the women around him were required to maintain. He was the king. This was, in the world as constituted, sufficient explanation. What is left is the record that silence leaves behind, the spaces in the archive, the burned letters, the carefully worded memoirs, the deathbed scenes reconstructed from partial accounts, and the living legacy that took the form of a woman who married the king's great-great-grandson in 2005 in a civil ceremony at Windsor Guildhall. That ceremony was notable, among other things, for being witnessed by the institution that had spent 2 centuries managing exactly this kind of situation, now finally making it official. The Church of England, which had refused to countenance Wallis Simpson and had required the abdication, conducted a service of blessing at St. George's Chapel, Windsor, the same chapel where Edward VII had married Alexandra in 1863, and gave the whole thing its formal approval. The Archbishop of Canterbury stood up and said, with the institution behind him, "This is acceptable." Alice Keppel was not alive to see it, but her great-granddaughter was there, in a Philip Tracy hat, receiving the blessing. Whether Alice would have considered this things being done better or things being done differently is a question that history cannot answer. She had moved through a world where the system managed everything through silence and management, and the occasional expenditure of £64,000. Her great-granddaughter moved through a world where the management had mostly broken down and the only thing left was to be transparent enough, for long enough, that the institution eventually ran out of reasons to object. Both approaches required a specific kind of intelligence. Both required a specific kind of patience. Both required understanding the nature of the institution you were dealing with and deciding what you were willing to give it and what you were not. The women who preceded them had understood all of this and paid for the understanding in the particular coin of the Edwardian world, in silence, in children whose paternity was never acknowledged, in letters burned, in deathbed scenes conducted through side entrances. The word that runs through all of this, the word that defines the world these women inhabited and the terms on which they inhabited it, is not love, though love was certainly present, and it is not duty, though duty was constantly invoked. It is not even silence, which is the most obvious word and the one most often applied. The word is cost. Everything in the world of the women around King Edward VII had a cost, and the cost was different for different women depending on what they had brought into the arrangement, what they needed to protect, and how clearly they had understood the terms when they accepted them. Alexandra paid in years of publicly maintained dignity and privately burned letters. Lillie paid in a daughter she could not fully acknowledge. Daisy paid in political principle, in the specific irony of a socialist countess trading her lover's letters for cash. Agnes paid in obscurity, which may have been what she wanted. Alice paid in her reputation, in the scene at the deathbed, in the side entrance to the funeral, and perhaps in the private things that the record was not allowed to contain. The king paid very little, relatively speaking. He was the king. The system was designed with this particular asymmetry built in and running on it. The women maintained the code and the code maintained the king's freedom, and the freedom was exercised again and again across 5 decades, and the costs were distributed among the women who had agreed, each in her particular way, to accept them. They were never supposed to speak about it. Some of them chose not to. Some of them chose not to until they needed the money. One of them was made unable to choose at all. What they left behind, in the spaces between the burned letters and the carefully worded pages and the hospital built in a drawing room in Belgravia, is this: the record of a world that asked women to contain enormous things and rewarded them for the containment with a specific kind of visibility and a specific kind of invisibility, and which produced in the women who managed it most successfully a quality that looked like grace. Whether it was grace, or something harder and more carefully maintained, is the question the record leaves open. The world in which all of this took place was very specific and is now largely gone, and because it is gone, the habits of mind it produced can look, at this distance, like madness or like grace, depending on your sympathies, but it was not madness and it was not exactly grace. It was a system, with its own logic, its own rewards, and its own penalties. Understanding it requires understanding first that the people inside it were not simply trapped by it. They were participants who had made assessments and accepted terms. The terms were often bad. The assessments were sometimes incorrect, but the system had an internal coherence that made it stable for a very long time. To put it plainly, the late Victorian and early Edwardian upper class had a way of managing the gap between what it publicly required of its members and what those members privately did. The management required infrastructure, silence, and the cooperation of people at every level of the social architecture, from footmen who had not seen what they had seen to newspaper editors who knew what they knew and printed something else. The Prince of Wales and his circle were not the inventors of this system, they inherited it, but Bertie, as he was always called, refined it and extended it and made it the operating principle of a social world that thousands of people moved through with varying degrees of success for the 40 years he occupied the position of heir apparent. He was helped in this by the specific qualities of the women around him, not all of them and not equally. Some helped by understanding the code and following it. Some helped by managing the code on his behalf so thoroughly that he barely had to think about it. Some failed to help, or helped with conditions attached that eventually made helping something else entirely. And one, the last and most comprehensive, helped so completely and so intelligently that she essentially became the administrator of the thing, the human infrastructure through which the entire system ran. Each of these women had a story before the prince came into it, and each of their stories is shaped by the specific world they came from, the assets they brought, and the calculations they made. What this account tries to do is tell those stories on their own terms, without reducing any of these women to their relationship with a man, while acknowledging that the relationship with the man is why we know who they were. The silences they maintained are where the interesting things live. The world that Bertie built around himself, beginning in the early 1860s, was a deliberate reversal of everything his parents had created. Victoria and Albert had made the monarchy moral. The Marlborough House set, named for the London palace where Bertie and Alexandra lived, made the monarchy human. The distinction matters. Moral in the Victorian sense that Albert had intended it meant disciplined, self-controlled, spiritually serious, publicly exemplary. Human meant sociable, pleasure-seeking, entertaining and entertained, physically alive to the world. Bertie chose human the moment he was old enough to choose anything, and he chose it with the particular force of a man who had been denied it for so long that the choice had the energy of a compulsion. The Marlborough House set, by the 1870s, was the centre of social England. If you were in the set, you were invited everywhere that mattered. If you were not in the set, you could still attend the events, but you would attend them as someone the set permitted to be there, which was a different thing. The composition of the set was partly aristocratic, since the great families had seats and resources that made the scale of Bertie's social ambitions physically possible, but it was not exclusively aristocratic. There were financiers, there were actors and performers. There were Americans, notably Lady Randolph Churchill and several others, who had married into British money or title, and brought with them the particular energy of people from a culture that had not yet organized its social hierarchy into stone. What held all of it together was Bertie's specific gift, the ability to make every person in any room feel that they were the one whose presence mattered most. This is not a simple gift. It requires a particular quality of attention genuinely given that most people can manage for an hour and then run out of. Bertie appears to have had it in quantities that did not deplete. People who met him at official functions, people who had no particular reason to have a favorable opinion of the heir to the throne, consistently described the same thing. He made you feel that he had been waiting for specifically you to arrive, and was glad you had. This quality in a man, combined with his position, his resources, and his genuine interest in attractive women, produced a very specific kind of danger for the women who responded to it. The feeling of being specifically chosen is one of the most persuasive feelings available to a human being. In a context where women's options were organized largely around the choices of men, being chosen by this particular man had specific material and social consequences that went well beyond the emotional appeal. Women who caught Bertie's sustained attention found their social position shifted in ways that were real and lasting. Hostesses who might previously have been politely condescending suddenly became warmly welcoming. Invitations appeared for events that had previously been closed. The subtle social arithmetic of who was acknowledged first in a room, who was seated where, who was approached and who was approached less, shifted in the direction of greater visibility and greater ease. This is what kept the system running. The benefits were real. There was a third public crisis that must be included in any account of how the code worked and how it could fail. The Tranby-Croft Baccarat scandal of 1890. Bertie was staying as a guest at Tranby-Croft, the Yorkshire home of a shipping magnate named Arthur Wilson, during the St. Leger race meeting in September. Baccarat was played in the evenings, as it was played in many of the country houses Bertie visited, and on the second evening of play 5 of the guests separately observed that one of their fellow players, a military officer named Sir William Gordon Cumming, appeared to be cheating. He was manipulating his stakes after seeing the cards, adding to his bet when the cards were favorable and removing chips when they were not. The witnesses compared notes. Gordon Cumming was confronted privately and offered the choice: sign a promise never to play cards again in exchange for the silence of everyone present, or face the formal accusation. He signed. The secret lasted 8 months. Then it leaked, as secrets in that world eventually did, and Gordon Cumming, faced with public accusation, sued for slander. The trial took place in June of 1891, and Bertie appeared as a witness again, for the second time in his life, in a court of law. He had been at the table. He had seen what the others had seen. He had agreed to the private resolution. The public reaction was fierce, in a direction slightly different from the Mordaunt case. The criticism this time was not primarily about women, it was about gambling. The heir to the throne had been participating in illegal gambling. He was being called as a witness in a case that turned on the specific mechanics of baccarat. Reynolds' newspaper was at it again. Church groups wrote letters. The Archbishop of Canterbury made his views known. Victoria was, as she often was, extremely displeased. She wrote to Bertie that the whole affair shocked and grieved her, which, given their history, was at least familiar territory. Gordon Cumming lost the case. He was socially destroyed in the manner the system reserved for people who had violated its internal agreements. He had signed a promise of silence. The promise had been broken, and whatever the legal outcome, his position in the world the set occupied was finished. What the Tranby-Croft affair demonstrated, alongside the Mordaunt case and the Beresford affair, was that the system's maintenance of silence required active work. It did not simply hold itself together through the shared interest of the participants. It required periodically the application of significant pressure, the deployment of legal mechanisms, the investment of social capital in managing consequences, and it required people who were skilled at that management. The specific nature of Daisy's affair with the prince deserves more attention than most accounts give it, because the specific nature of it is what made the eventual rupture, and the letters, so significant. This was not a casual arrangement. Daisy was not simply a beautiful woman whom the prince found pleasant company. She was someone with whom he discussed things. She had opinions about politics, about foreign affairs, about the state of the country. She argued with him. She challenged his positions. She told him when she thought he was wrong about something, which was not a thing that many people told the Prince of Wales, and which he apparently found refreshing rather than intolerable. His letters to her, described in general terms by people who had access to them before they disappeared, contained exactly this kind of material: references to politicians by name, assessments of foreign governments that went considerably beyond what he could say officially, opinions about events in South Africa and India and on the continent that reflected a private version of his diplomatic thinking. There was personal material too, naturally, but the political content was what made the letters dangerous in ways that exceeded the personal embarrassment. A dead king's opinions about living politicians, expressed in letters to his mistress, were a different kind of problem from the usual royal love letter. They were evidence of what he had actually thought, which might or might not have aligned with what his government had officially done. They were material for arguments about whether the late king had influenced policy in ways that were not constitutionally legitimate. They were, in short, a political problem as well as a personal one. If this history is keeping you watching, subscribe now and leave a comment below telling us which of these women you find most compelling. We publish new royal documentary content every week, and the stories you are watching are the ones that the palace spent a century trying to prevent anyone from finding. This is why Stamfordham worked as hard as he did, and why Ducroz's baronetcy was worth £64,000 to the institution. Daisy's socialist activities, meanwhile, continued throughout this period with a genuine commitment that eventually outran her personal embarrassment about asking a socialist for money to pay her debts. She donated to the Social Democratic Federation. She paid for free meals for schoolchildren in the parishes she controlled as a landowner. She established the Studley College for Women, which continued in operation for decades as a practical educational institution for women in agriculture, horticulture, and rural management. She ran for Parliament in 1923 as a Labour candidate and was defeated by a majority that would have given pause to a less resilient person. She kept writing, she kept talking. She spoke at meetings in venues that her presence made somewhat surreal for the people who had known her as the most celebrated hostess of the Edwardian era. A countess attending socialist meetings was considered amusing by her enemies and genuinely moving by her supporters, and Daisy seems to have been comfortable with both responses. Her memoirs, when they appeared, gave historians a great deal of useful material about the social texture of the Edwardian world, and almost nothing about what she and the king had said to each other in private. She was interviewed by journalists throughout her later life, and was entertaining, sharp, occasionally indiscreet about small things, and absolutely reliable about keeping the large things sealed. The story of Violet Trefusis is worth dwelling on, not because it is typical of the world her mother inhabited, but because it is its opposite, and the opposition tells you something about what Alice's world required. Violet Keppel was born in 1894, when her mother was 25 and had not yet met the Prince of Wales. She grew up in the particular environment that Alice's position created, a household that was elegant, well-funded, socially prominent, and organized around a central relationship that was both present and never discussed. The king visited, the king was warm, the king was there, and then he was not, and then he was again, and the household was arranged around this rhythm without anyone naming what the rhythm meant. Violet absorbed something from this environment that was the opposite of discretion. She fell in love with an intensity that she was constitutionally unable to manage or contain, with Vita Sackville West, who was equally unable to manage or contain it. The affair began when they were teenagers and continued well into their adult lives, through Violet's marriage to Denise Trefusis and Vita's marriage to Harold Nicholson, through years of what their letters describe as the most profound emotional engagement either of them had experienced, through the anguish of separation and reunion and the specific social damage of being what they were in the world they were in. Alice Keppel was not sympathetic, she was horrified. She attempted on multiple occasions and through multiple mechanisms to end the relationship, separate her daughter from Vita, and manage the situation in the specific way she had managed every situation in her adult life. Through judicious pressure applied at the right moments by the right people, the management failed comprehensively. Violet and Vita continued the affair, wrote thousands of letters, and eventually both wrote books and articles about their experiences that ensured their relationship would be documented in considerable detail for subsequent generations. What Alice thought about this, about a daughter who had refused to keep the code in the specific domain that mattered most to Violet, is not directly recorded. She was unhappy about it. Beyond that, her private response is in the archive of what she did not say. There is something worth thinking about in the contrast between mother and daughter. Alice had built a life on the ability to contain herself, to be present in a room and yet never too present, to love and be loved and manage both without either overflowing the bounds of what the world she inhabited would accept. Violet did the opposite with a thoroughness that looked, from a certain angle, like a reaction against exactly what her mother represented. Whether it was consciously so is not knowable, but it had the character of a daughter who had watched the containing and decided she would rather overflow. The weeks before Edward VII's death deserve the same close attention as the death itself, because the weeks before contain the mechanism by which everything was managed. He had been deteriorating since the previous year. The bronchitis that had troubled him for years had grown more severe. He had been briefly unconscious during a state visit to Berlin in February of 1909. His doctors knew, his household knew, the people around him, including Alice, knew in the specific way that people know things they are not yet prepared to formally acknowledge. He refused to modify his behavior. He continued to smoke. He continued to eat in the quantities that had earned him the nickname Tum Tum in his younger years, and that had, by 1910, given him a silhouette that his tailors had learned to accommodate as a matter of professional necessity. He continued to travel, continued to see people, continued to conduct himself as though the body's accumulating commentary on the subject was simply irrelevant. This was in a way consistent with everything else about him. He had been told since the age of 2 what he was required to be, and he had chosen differently. He had been told that his behavior would ruin the monarchy, and the monarchy had been largely fine. He had been told that 60 years of excess would catch up with him, and he had outlasted the warnings for long enough that perhaps he had begun to believe they were wrong. Now the warnings were catching up, and he was responding to them the way he had responded to all warnings, by continuing. Alexandra returned from Corfu on May 5, 1910. She had been visiting her brother King George I of Greece, who would himself be assassinated 3 years later. She came back to London because the reports from the household had reached a level of urgency she could not ignore. She arrived on a Tuesday evening and found her husband worse than the reports had suggested. On May 6th, he was moved from room to room in the palace, refusing to lie down, receiving his papers, seeing his horses run at Kempton Park by way of a message delivered to him in the afternoon. The horses ran. Which of the heir won, he was told, and he managed to be glad. Alice had been positioned somewhere in the network of the palace, or possibly at her own house nearby, waiting for whatever was going to happen. She had the letter. She had shown it to Alexandra. She was waiting to see whether Alexandra would honor the letter or override it. Alexandra honored it. The decision to let Alice in when she made it was the decision of a woman who had spent 47 years choosing dignity over reaction, and who chose dignity one last time even when the cost of it was enormous. She let Alice in because her husband had asked for it, because the letter made it his request rather than simply Alice's desire, and because the woman who had spent 5 decades choosing what to be above what she felt chose, even here, not to close the door on her husband's wish. The connection between Alice Keppel and Camilla Parker Bowles deserves the more careful attention that proximity to the present day makes possible. Sonia Keppel, Alice's younger daughter, wrote her memoir of an Edwardian childhood not as a confession or a revelation but as a preservation. She was preserving a world that had already ended by the time she was writing, a world in which the particular arrangements her mother had moved through seemed as remote as another country. She wrote about it with warmth and a gentle humor that conveyed, without ever stating it, that she had loved and respected her mother, and had understood that her mother had been doing something difficult extremely well. Rosalind Cubitt, Sonia's daughter and Alice's granddaughter, grew up in that inheritance. She married Bruce Shand, who was a cavalry officer and wine merchant, and their life was comfortable, respectable, and not notably entangled with the royal family. The connection was historical, not active. Camilla Shand, born in 1947, was the oldest of their 3 children. She grew up in East Sussex and London with a life that was socially similar to the world her great-grandmother had inhabited, in some respects, because the British social class that hunts and shoots and attends the same schools has a long memory and a small world. But the specific circumstances were different enough that nobody who knew Camilla as a child and teenager was thinking about Alice Keppel in relation to her. Then she met Prince Charles. The specific circumstances of how Camilla Shand and Prince Charles met have been told in various ways, with varying emphasis on what was chance and what was design. The polo match setting is standard. The reported opening remark about great-grandmothers, however it was actually phrased, has become a legend that people who know the story repeat because it compresses into a single sentence the entire weight of inherited circumstance. What followed, the decades-long relationship, the marriage to Andrew Parker Bowles, Charles's marriage to Diana, the affair's continuation through both marriages, the eventual divorces, the eventual official marriage, the eventual coronation at which Camilla was anointed queen consort while Charles was anointed king, took 40 years to arrive at its conclusion. The contrast with Alice Keppel's situation is sharpest at the end point. Alice ended her story at a side entrance to a funeral. Camilla ended hers being anointed in Westminster Abbey. The question of whether Diana Spencer broke the code or simply lived in a context where the code was no longer enforceable is one that different people will answer differently depending on their sympathies. The code required the cooperation of several institutions that still operated in Alice Keppel's era but had ceased to reliably cooperate by Diana's. The press had operated through the 19th century and into the early 20th under a series of conventions about what was printed and what was withheld regarding the royal family. These conventions were not legal exactly, and they were tested periodically, but they generally held because the people who ran major newspapers either shared the class assumptions of the people they were not reporting on, or had learned that certain reports caused legal and social complications that made them not worth printing. By the 1980s, those conventions had eroded significantly. The newspaper industry had changed in ways that made deference less financially rational than competition. The legal mechanisms had become less effective at suppression as the American press, operating without the relevant British legal frameworks, was willing to print things that British newspapers could not, and the British public was willing to buy publications that printed what the mainstream withheld. Diana understood this eventually. She understood that she was in a context where the code could not protect her, and where the code was not in any meaningful sense protecting the interests she needed protected. She had been managed in the specific way that the institution managed people since the moment she was identified as a potential wife for Charles. The management had required her silence on multiple topics, including the state of her marriage, and the silence had not been compensated with the particular advantages that silence had provided to the women in Alice Keppel's world. She had no career that the association had enabled. She had no social position that the association enhanced. She had the title and the children and the public role, but she also had a marriage that she described in her Panorama interview as a rather crowded one, and a husband who had never by her account fully transferred his emotional attention from Camilla. The Panorama interview, broadcast on the 20th of November 1995, was watched by 23 million people in Britain. Diana spoke directly about her marriage, about Charles's relationship with Camilla, about her own mental health struggles, about feeling she had not been supported by the institution. She was careful and specific, and occasionally devastating. She said she had loved her husband. She said she had hoped to be the queen of people's hearts. She said she thought there were 3 people in her marriage. Nothing like this had ever been broadcast before. Nothing like this had ever been said in public by someone in her position about a British royal marriage. It was, in the most literal sense possible, the breaking of the code. What Alexandra said to her children about her husband's affairs, in the private moments that are not in any archive, is one of those questions the record cannot answer, and imagination should approach carefully. What is known is that her children were devoted to her in a way that suggests she gave them something sustaining. George V, who inherited his father's position and his father's role but not his father's temperament, was a man of notably simple personal life who married a woman he was faithful to and raised his children with a strictness that left its own marks. He attributed much of his emotional stability to his mother, though he did not elaborate on the specific forms that stability took. His relationship with his father was complicated in the ways that sons of powerful, charismatic, difficult fathers are always complicated. His relationship with his mother was simple. He loved her, and she had always been there. Alexandra's relationship with her sister Dagmar, who had married Tsar Alexander III of Russia and become Empress Marie Fyodorovna, was one of the deep continuities of her life. The 2 women had grown up together in Denmark and maintained a closeness that the geography of their adult lives made physically difficult, but did not diminish. They visited each other when they could. They wrote letters. After the Russian Revolution, when Marie Fyodorovna escaped Russia and spent her remaining years in Denmark, and after Edward VII was long dead, the 2 old women had each other in a way that was probably the most unambiguous intimacy of either of their lives. 2 Danish girls who had married into empires and survived them. Alexandra outlived the empire her sister had inhabited, outlived her husband, outlived many of the women who had been part of the Marlborough House world. She died in 1925 at Sandringham, surrounded by the dogs and the children and the grandchildren that the public association with her had made, across 60 years, synonymous with the idea of a queen who was genuinely loved. She had maintained the code for 60 years. She was the one who maintained it longest, and whose maintenance cost the most, and who received the least formal credit for the maintenance. This is not an accident of history. This is how the system distributed its acknowledgements. Rosa Lewis and her relationship with the Edwardian social machinery deserves its own extended treatment because she represents a category that has largely disappeared, the professional enabler whose professionalism consisted entirely of knowing things and not saying them. She had trained as a cook in the households of various aristocratic families, demonstrating a talent that eventually brought her to the attention of patrons who could make her career. She cooked for the Prince of Wales on multiple occasions. She cooked for his circle. She learned, through the specific intimacy of kitchens and service corridors, and the particular confidences of people who assume the person making their dinner is not listening, an enormous amount about the private lives of the people she served. The Cavendish Hotel, which she took over in 1902 and ran for the next 40 years, became something specific that is difficult to describe accurately. It was a hotel. It was also a kind of private club. It was also for certain purposes an address. People stayed at the Cavendish who needed to stay somewhere discreet. People met at the Cavendish for conversations that needed to happen without witnesses who would remember them. Rosa Lewis managed all of this with a combination of warmth, humor, and absolute silence about the specific arrangements. She was interviewed repeatedly in her very old age. She was still living at the Cavendish, still presiding over a clientele that by then included the children and grandchildren of people she had served in the Edward VII years. She was funny and warm and occasionally sharp-tongued about people she had found tiresome, but on the specific question of who had been there and what they had been doing, she was consistent. She had known people very well, she said. She had known them very well indeed, and she intended to keep it at that. Evelyn Waugh based a character on her in the novel Vile Bodies, published in 1930, which suggests that her reputation had become famous enough to attract fictional treatment within her own lifetime. The character in the novel is similarly warm, similarly voluble about everything except the specific things that mattered, and similarly at the center of a world that is simultaneously celebratory and on the verge of dissolving. Rosa Lewis died in 1952. She was 85 years old. The Cavendish Hotel outlived her and was eventually demolished and rebuilt, but the new Cavendish on Jermyn Street preserved the name, the way institutions preserve the names of things they cannot otherwise afford to keep. The mechanics of maintaining silence in a context where silence was required deserve more attention than they usually receive, because silence does not maintain itself, it requires specific practices. Letters were the primary vulnerability. In a context where the telephone was not yet the primary means of private communication, people wrote to each other constantly, and what they wrote had a permanence that spoken words did not. The code's practitioners were aware of this. Some of them burned letters routinely as a matter of course, so that nothing remained that could be misread at a later date. Others kept letters and then burned them selectively, preserving the portions of their correspondence that were unembarrassing and destroying the rest. Bertie kept letters. This was the first problem. He wrote letters and he received letters and he did not invariably destroy them, which meant that somewhere, in the residue of the various households and hotels and houses he had used across his adult life, there were documents. Daisy's letters were among them. Alice's letters may have been among them. What was done with all of it at his death is not fully documented. George V, who was his father's son in the limited sense of having inherited the position and a portion of the personality, and none of the specific habits that generated the correspondence, was apparently aware of the risk. Lord Stamfordham, who had moved through the Daisy-Warwick crisis, was still available to manage consequences. There is evidence of significant archival work performed in the first months and years of the new reign, work whose purpose was to reduce the quantity of material that could later become a problem. The servants were the second vulnerability. Servants who had seen things retained, in their memories, information that could theoretically be transmitted. The practice of the era managed this through a combination of employment dependency, social stigma attached to speaking out of turn, and the specific training that domestic service provided about what constituted appropriate behavior. A housemaid who spoke about what she had seen was a housemaid who had broken the essential promise of her position, and her position was dependent on the promise being kept. There were exceptions, there were people who broke the code, but the exceptions were managed in specific ways that limited their impact. Legal threats, social pressure, financial arrangements, and in some cases simple damage to the credibility of the person speaking. If a housemaid reported something to a newspaper and the newspaper printed it, the newspaper could be sued and the housemaid could be characterized as disgruntled, unreliable, or confused. In a context where the people with power also controlled the legal system and the social definition of credibility, the code was significantly more durable than it would be in a later era. The Edwardian era, which runs roughly from 1901 to 1914, and takes its character from the 9 years of Edward VII's reign, rather than from any strict calendrical precision, has a specific atmosphere in the historical record that is not entirely accurate and is not entirely false. The popular image of the Edwardian period is of enormous comfort and social ease, of long summer afternoons and elaborate dinners, and a world in which certain people lived very well indeed and worried very little about it. This image is drawn largely from the memoirs and reminiscences of the people who inhabited the top of that world, and so it captures the experience of those people with reasonable accuracy while omitting, almost entirely, the experience of the very large number of people who inhabited the bottom of it. For the women this account is concerned with, the Edwardian era was a specific combination of enormous privilege and specific constraint. The privilege was real, the houses were large, the food was extraordinary. The travel was regular and comfortable in ways that would not have been possible a generation earlier and would become impossible again during the war. The social possibilities were, for women of the right class and the right appearance and the right particular combination of qualities, quite broad. The constraint was also real. Women did not vote until 1918, and then only women over 30, and then only with property qualifications and not with full and equal voting rights until 1928. Women did not have the right to initiate divorce until later. Women did not control their own property after marriage until the Married Women's Property Act of 1882, and even that act left considerable practical limitations. The women in this account were not legally constrained by poverty or formal exclusion from the same ways that working-class women were, but they were constrained by the social requirements of a world that had very specific ideas about how women should conduct themselves, and very effective mechanisms for enforcing those ideas. The Code of Silence was both a symptom and a reinforcement of this constraint. It required women to manage information in ways that protected the system while accepting the costs. It rewarded compliance and punished defection. It distributed privileges to women who followed it and removed those privileges, along with others, from women who did not. The remarkable thing is not that this system existed. Similar systems existed throughout most of recorded history, with local variations in the specific arrangements. The remarkable thing is how well documented it is in this particular case, because the specific women who moved through it were literate, articulate, and socially prominent enough that their stories left traces even when those traces were designed to be minimal. After Edward VII's death in May of 1910, Alice and George Keppel sold their London house and left England. They travelled extensively in the Far East, spending 2 years in a journey that took them across Asia in the specific leisured way that wealthy Edwardians travelled when they needed to be somewhere else for a while. When they returned to England, they moved to a new house in Grosvenor Street. Alice remained a social figure of some prominence, but the particular prominence that had attended her position as the king's favourite was over, and she seems to have known it and accepted it. She was no longer at the centre of anything politically significant. She was a woman of middle age with resources, with connections, with a husband who was still her companion, and with a reputation that was understood without being spoken about, which was precisely how she preferred it. During the First World War, she ran, with a friend, a hospital in Boulogne, contributing the kind of practical organizational intelligence that the position of royal mistress had also required, but in a context that was officially acknowledged and formally useful. She helped establish herself in the years of the war as something other than the thing she had been in the years before it. In the 1920s, she and George moved to Florence, where they acquired the Villa dell'Ombrellina, which had views across the city and gardens that Alice tended with the same attention she had applied to the social arrangements of London drawing rooms. Florence was not retirement in any diminished sense. It was a relocation to a world where she could be a social center in her own right, where the English and American expatriate community found in her a hostess of formidable ability, where the beauty and intelligence and management skills that had defined her position at the English court could be applied in a context that was entirely hers. When the Second World War came, the Keppels abandoned their Florence villa and returned to England, where they lived at the Ritz Hotel. George Keppel died in September of 1947. Alice died 13 days later. Whether she died of grief is a question that sentiment suggests and medicine cannot confirm. What is certain is that she died in September of 1947, 6 weeks after her great-granddaughter Camilla Shand was born. The two women who bookend this particular story overlapped by 6 weeks. Camilla Shand never met Alice Keppel. She knew her through family stories, through her grandmother Sonia's memoir, through the particular inheritance of family legend that shapes a child's understanding of where they come from before they have the vocabulary to ask questions about it. A note on what the women in this account made possible, which is separate from what they experienced. Edward VII became king in January of 1901, at the age of 59. His mother had died at Osborne House on the Isle of Wight, attended by her German grandchildren as well as her British ones, still formidable at 81, the longest reigning monarch Britain had ever had. Bertie, who had been Prince of Wales for 59 years, was suddenly king. Almost everyone who knew him expected a disaster. He had no administrative experience. He had spent 40 years being excluded from government. He had demonstrated in public a preference for pleasure over duty that gave little obvious indication of political capacity. What happened instead was something that surprised even people who had liked him. He was, it turned out, extraordinarily effective at the specific things that a constitutional monarch in the early 20th century needed to do. He was charming with foreign leaders in a way that opened conversations that formal diplomacy could not. He was warmly regarded by the French, who were used to a certain level of reserve from British royalty, and who found in Edward something they could respond to. The Entente Cordiale of 1904, the diplomatic agreement that brought Britain and France into formal alignment and contributed to the alliance structure that would define the First World War, owed something to his personal cultivation of French goodwill. He was good with politicians in ways that Victoria had never been, because his 40 years of social life had given him an intuitive grasp of how people worked that no amount of constitutional theory could have produced. He understood that the Prime Minister needed to feel respected, and the Foreign Secretary needed to feel useful, and the opposition leader needed to feel heard, and he provided each of these things with an ease that seemed natural because it had been practiced for half a century. The women in this account are not responsible for his diplomatic effectiveness, but they are part of the infrastructure that produced it. The social world he had maintained for 40 years, the world they had inhabited and managed and maintained their silence about, was where he had developed the skills he brought to the kingship. The drawing rooms and dinner parties and house parties and country weekends, the long training in making rooms work and making people feel welcome, and managing the human arithmetic of mixed company, had produced something that looked from the outside like natural talent and was actually acquired skill. Alice Keppel in particular functioned in the later years of the reign as a kind of unofficial back channel for political communication. Ministers who could not approach the king directly through official means sometimes approached through Alice, who would raise the matter with the king in a context that made the response possible. This was not constitutionally appropriate in the sense that the constitution did not have a role called the king's mistress, but it was practically effective in the sense that it worked. Whether this represented influence or facilitation is a distinction that different historians have drawn differently. The world that King Edward VII and the women around him had constructed and maintained did not simply end with his death in May of 1910, but his death was where it began to end. George V was 45 years old when he became king. He was a naval officer by training and preference, a man of rigorous personal habits and genuine religious conviction, who found the specific Edwardian style of his father's court as alien as his father would have found his. He kept his wife close and his social circle small. He did not keep mistresses. He was, by the standards of European monarchy in any era, unusually faithful to the marriage he had made. The great country houses that had provided the physical architecture for the system continued to exist through the 1910s and 20s, but their character was changing. The death toll of the First World War fell particularly heavily on the male aristocracy, whose sense of duty sent them into the lines in proportions that their class's specific traditions about honor and responsibility had made predictable. Country houses without heirs, taxed by death duties and by the economic dislocations of the war, began the process of diminishment that would, by the mid-20th century, leave many of them as national trust properties or hotels. The world in which a great house could accommodate 50 guests for a weekend party with 20 or 30 domestic staff to manage the arrangements, and in which the financial and social architecture necessary to maintain this for 100 nights a year existed and was available, that world ended in the trenches and in the changed tax code and in the shifted expectations of domestic workers who had options they had not had before. The specific form of the system the women around Edward VII had inhabited depended on this world. Without the great houses, without the 60-person households and the discreet corridor arrangements, and the footmen who had not seen what they had seen, the management of the thing would have been significantly harder. It was not impossible without all of this, as Charles and Camilla proved across 4 decades, but it was different. The context had changed and the terms had changed with it. There is one more woman whose presence at the edges of this account deserves acknowledgement before it concludes: Queen Mary, who was George V's wife and the daughter-in-law of Alexandra and the woman who lived in the immediate aftermath of the world this account describes. Mary of Teck had married Prince George, later George V, in 1893. She was a figure of considerable personal strength and considerable personal rigidity, a woman who had been raised in reduced circumstances relative to her royal connections, and who had compensated by developing an almost architectural relationship with formality and procedure. She knew the rules. She enforced the rules. She had very little patience with deviation from the rules. She disliked Alice Keppel, she disliked the position Alice occupied, and she disliked the arrangements that made that position possible. She was not a hypocrite in the specific Victorian way of the Marlborough House set, which is to say she did not accept the arrangements as facts of life and then privately disapprove while publicly accommodating. She disapproved openly, within the limits of her position, and she made her disapproval felt in the specific ways available to a princess and then a queen, in who was and was not received at court, in how certain names were and were not spoken, in what was and was not allowed in the households she controlled. This disapproval did not change the facts of the world she had entered through her marriage, but it changed the tone. The Edwardian arrangement ended partly because the king who had sustained it died, and partly because the woman who became queen did not find it acceptable, and partly because the world that had made it possible was being dismantled from the outside at the same time it was being changed from the inside. Mary of Teck's specific relationship to silence was very different from Alice Keppel's. Both were silent about important things, but Alice's silence was the silence of a woman who had agreed to the terms and honored them. Mary's was the silence of a woman who disapproved of the terms and was waiting for the world to change. Eventually, it changed. Before we get to any of this, sit with the deathbed scene for a moment longer. Buckingham Palace, May 6, 1910. The king has had his heart attacks. He has refused to lie down. He is still insisting he will work to the end. His son, soon to be George V, is present and watching his father refuse to acknowledge what is happening. Alexandra is in the room. The household is gathered in that specific state of suspended urgency that attaches to deathbeds of important people. Alice Keppel is somewhere in the palace. Exactly where and how she came to be there, and how long she had been there, and what conversations happened before the decision was made to admit her, are things the record does not preserve in full. What the record preserves is the decision. Alexandra allowed her in. Now hold those two women in your mind simultaneously. The wife, the mistress, in the same room, at a deathbed, in 1910. The wife is 65 years old. She has been married to this man for 47 years. She has been beautiful and charming and deaf and loyal, and the mother of his children, and the one person in his world who could not be dismissed and could not be replaced, and was, for that reason, the one person he was most consistently thoughtless with, because he knew she would remain. She has known about the women for decades. She has known about Alice specifically for 12 years. She has never in 12 years made a formal scene or issued an ultimatum or gone to the newspapers or done any of the things available to her that would have forced the situation into public reckoning. She has maintained the thing that was required of her, and she has maintained it without anyone ever quite thanking her for it. The mistress is 41 years old. She has been the king's most constant companion for 12 years. She has run his social life. She has talked to his ministers on his behalf. She has kept his secrets. She has managed his moods and his social calendar and his emotional needs with a competence that the people who relied on it took entirely for granted. She has never made a public claim to anything. She has never threatened to speak. She has never pressed for more than was offered or asked for what was not available. She has been, in the specific language of her world, perfectly correct. They are both in the room because of the same man and because of choices they each made about who they would be in relation to him. And when he dies, one of them will walk back to her place in the official record, and one of them will walk out through a side entrance. This is what the Code of Silence built. The specific question of why Edward VII had the relationships he had, beyond the obvious answer that he had them because he could, is worth a more careful examination. The obvious answer is true, but incomplete. Men with power in every era have had access to women that men without power do not, and the specific power Bertie wielded was of a kind that made resistance to his attention both socially costly and generally unnecessary. Nobody was physically coerced. The women who entered his orbit chose to be there. But the choosing happened within a specific set of circumstances that shaped the options available, and ignoring the circumstances in favor of a simple story about choice is another form of the same inaccuracy that ignoring the agency in favor of a simple story about constraint produces. What the circumstances offered to a woman in Bertie's circle was significant: social access, financial ease of varying degrees, the particular warmth of being genuinely liked by someone whose liking meant something, and for women who had specific ambitions, specific leverage. What the circumstances required in exchange was significant too: the silence, the management of whatever feeling developed in the course of the thing, the acceptance that the arrangement was not permanent and would end on terms that were not the woman's to determine, the maintenance of appearances, being charming in rooms where the wife was present, being invisible in rooms where visibility would cause problems, being available when needed and absent when needed. This is not a simple exchange. It required the kind of intelligence that the world Bertie's mother had designed did not recognize as intelligence, because it was social intelligence, emotional intelligence, the intelligence of managing people and situations, and the Victorian hierarchy of mental accomplishments put linguistic and mathematical reasoning above all of these. The women who did this work were considered by the official taxonomy to be decorative. Many of them were also extraordinarily capable. The career that Lillie Langtry built after the affair with the prince ended is worth examining on its own terms, separate from the royal connection, because it is genuinely remarkable. She began acting in 1881, which was in terms of the social position of actresses approximately the equivalent of choosing to enter a different caste. Women of good family did not go on the stage. The stage was for people who needed to earn money publicly, which was itself considered a form of social disqualification, and for women specifically it carried connotations of accessibility that made the profession in polite company a topic carefully moved through. Bertie changed this, for Lillie specifically and for the theatre world more generally. He opened Marlborough House to theatre people. He attended productions and was seen to attend them. He publicly associated himself with the stage and with the people who worked on it, in a way that was a clear social statement. The heir to the throne considered this legitimate. If he considered it legitimate, the Marlborough House set considered it legitimate. If the Marlborough House set considered it legitimate, a significant portion of fashionable London did too. For Lillie, this gave her entry to a profession that would have been closed to a woman of her background without the specific permission that the Royal Association provided. She was aware of this. She built on it with a thoroughness and an energy that would have been impressive regardless of her starting point. She toured North America. She had, by the time she first toured in the early 1880s, already been famous in England long enough that her fame had crossed the Atlantic, and American audiences who had never seen her came to the theatre to see the woman they had read about in the society columns. She was a draw before she had demonstrated any particular theatrical talent, which gave her the luxury of learning her craft in front of audiences who were already disposed to like her. She learned. She was not a great actress in the sense that Sarah Bernhardt was a great actress, but she was a skilled and professional performer who understood her audiences and knew how to manage the specific kind of performance that her particular combination of celebrity and beauty required. She became an American citizen in 1897, which was a statement about where she had decided her future lay. She was in her mid-40s by then, still beautiful in a way that photographs confirmed, and she had built something in America that she had not had in England: an independent life, with independent income, on independent terms. She bought property in California. She established a Lillie Langtry ranch in Lake County that became genuinely her own, named a town after herself, grew grapes and produced wine that sold under her name. She opened theaters. She ran her racing stables in her borrowed male identity of Mr. Jersey, with the same systematic attention she brought to everything else. She sued people who cheated her and won. She managed her business interests with competence that contemporary observers consistently found surprising in a woman, and that we at this distance can recognize as simply evidence that she was very good at it. She lived until 1929. She was 75 years old. She had outlived Edward VII by 19 years, outlived the Edwardian era by 15, outlived the First World War by a decade, and outlived most of the specific world she had been famous in by long enough that she was already historical, a figure from another time, when she died. She was buried in Jersey, the island she had left as a poor clergyman's daughter more than 50 years earlier, and that had been calling itself the home of the Jersey Lily for 4 decades. The relationship between Alexandra and her mother-in-law, Queen Victoria, is one of those secondary relationships that the surviving record captures in flashes, enough to see the shape of it, not enough to see it whole. Victoria did not dislike Alexandra. She was, in many of the letters that survive, warm toward her daughter-in-law in ways that suggest genuine appreciation for the specific qualities Alexandra possessed. Victoria was also, however, someone who managed her relationships through the lens of her own considerable needs and preferences, and one of those preferences was that the people she loved should be near her, available to her, responsive to her requirements. Alexandra, who was Danish and warm and devoted to her own family, was not primarily organized around Victoria's requirements. She maintained close ties with Copenhagen, with her parents and later with her siblings, with the Danish family network that was her emotional foundation. This was not a failure of filial duty, it was simply who she was, but it put her at a slight angle to Victoria's expectations. The more significant difficulty was Bertie's exclusion from government. Victoria refused to include Bertie in any official capacity, and her reasons for this refusal were partly genuine concern about his fitness, and partly something that looks, at this distance, like possessiveness about the role she had filled for so long that sharing it would have required a renegotiation of her own self-understanding. Bertie's lack of official role meant that he and Alexandra were perpetually at the edges of the machinery they were supposed to eventually run, and this arrangement had consequences for both of them. For Alexandra, it meant that her own position was always adjacent to power rather than inside it. She was the Princess of Wales for 38 years. She attended events, represented the family, travelled, charmed, and was charmed. She did all the visible things required of her position and was allowed almost none of the substance. When she finally became Queen Consort in 1901, she was 56 years old, and the shape of her life had been set for so long that queenship was largely a change of title rather than a transformation of role. She received Bertie's official correspondence. She was briefed, where it was constitutionally appropriate, on matters of state. She was consulted on matters of ceremony and court arrangements, and she continued to be the woman she had been for 3 decades, present, graceful, beloved, and largely unable to influence the things that most directly affected her life. The deafness had become total by the end. She communicated through lip reading and a few trusted attendants who knew how to speak to her clearly and slowly. The isolation this produced in a world that ran on spoken conversation was significant. She had chosen or developed as a strategy a particular mode of engaged attention. She watched. She watched faces. She watched body language. She watched the small physical tells that people produce without knowing they are producing them. She had been practicing this form of attention for decades by the time she was queen, and it had given her a quality that people who knew her described consistently as an ability to see through people to what they actually meant. Whether this quality served her in the specific way of making her feel more equipped to manage her situation, or whether it simply meant she saw more clearly than most the specific situation she was managing, is not possible to determine. Both probably. The Paris connection in Edward VII's romantic history is less fully documented than the London one, for reasons that have as much to do with the French press conventions of the period as with any deliberate suppression. Bertie loved Paris with a specificity that went well beyond the usual British aristocratic attachment to the city. He had his own suite at the Bristol Hotel, his own circle of friends and acquaintances in the city, his own schedule of performances and dinners and visits that he followed on his regular trips. He knew the city as few foreign visitors know any city, not as a tourist or a guest, but as a person who has spent enough time there to have a geography of the familiar. The women he knew in Paris included performers of the highest order. Hortense Schneider had been the most celebrated operetta performer in France in the 1860s and 70s, a woman of enormous talent and considerable beauty who had accumulated royal admirers from across Europe, with the specific efficiency of someone who operated at the intersection of art and pleasure, where European royalty naturally gathered. Bertie had known her, in some capacity, since his first visits to the city in the early part of his life. Sarah Bernhardt was a different kind of relationship and a different kind of woman. She was, by the consensus of virtually everyone who had seen her perform, the greatest actress of her era. She performed in multiple languages, traveled to every country that had a sufficiently large theatre and a sufficiently wealthy audience, and maintained her position at the center of the theatrical world for 6 decades. Bertie attended her performances regularly and sought her company privately with a frequency that London society noted. Whether the relationship extended beyond a genuine and deep appreciation for her art and personality into something more physically specific is one of those questions that the surviving sources decline to confirm or deny. What is certain is that she was not a woman who could easily be categorized, who could not be placed in the same position as Lillie Langtry or Daisy Warwick because she was famous on her own terms in a way that none of the English women were famous in quite the same way, and who occupied in the record a category that the system had not quite anticipated. A woman whose own stature was large enough that the association was between two equals rather than between a great man and his chosen companion. She outlived Edward VII by 13 years, dying in 1923, still working to the end in the way that great performers tend to. Her leg amputated after a fall, but her presence and her voice and her ability to make an audience forget everything except what was happening in front of them entirely intact. One of the more interesting questions in the history of the women around Edward VII is the question of prior knowledge. When these women agreed to enter the arrangements they entered, what did they know about what they were agreeing to? The answer varies by woman and by era. By the time Alice Keppel met the prince in 1898, the situation was fully legible to anyone paying attention to London society, which Alice absolutely was. She knew who Lillie Langtry was. She knew who Daisy Warwick was, or had been. She knew the terms and the character of the thing she was entering because the thing had been observable at close quarters for 20 years. She chose it with something approaching full information. Lillie Langtry in 1877 was working with less information and more instinct. She was 23 years old, married to a man who provided her with social access and nothing else she needed, and she was beautiful and clever in a world that was presenting her, through the specific accident of her looks, with options. The prince was one of those options. She chose him with the understanding that being chosen by him was an opportunity, and with some version of the understanding that opportunities of this specific kind had costs, but the specifics of the costs were not fully available to her at the beginning. Daisy Warwick may have had the clearest picture of the system's limitations and chose to enter it anyway, and then spent a long time deciding how to respond to those limitations. Her response, the socialist politics, the attempted publication, the eventual financial resolution, is the most complex of any of them. She entered a system, was shaped by it, was damaged by it, and eventually tried to weaponize the damage. This is not an unusual response to having been inside a system that extracted from you more than it provided. What is unusual is the specific form of it. She turned her experience into politics, into a critique of exactly the class that had produced her and used her and then left her in debt. The women who had the worst outcomes were those who had the least prior information and the fewest resources outside the arrangement. Harriet Mordaunt had neither a long-term connection to the world she had entered through her husband, nor the specific qualities that would have allowed her to manage what happened to her when the situation became impossible. She was young, she was not well, and she was inside a system that could not accommodate her crisis without protecting itself first. The weeks after Edward VII's death were managed by the court with the institutional competence that characterized the British monarchy's management of transitions. George V was immediately upon his father's death in possession of the position and the problems that came with it. He was a man who had watched his father closely for decades and drawn specific conclusions from what he had watched. He had seen the Mordaunt case and the Baccarat scandal and the Beresford affair and the Daisy Warwick letters situation, had observed the costs and the management requirements of the system his father had maintained, and had decided simply that he did not want to inherit the system along with the throne. He did not dismantle anything publicly. There was no announcement of new standards. There was no formal condemnation of what had preceded. There was simply a new court, with a different character, under the management of a man who was constitutionally and temperamentally nothing like his father, who was working to build a different kind of monarchy. The Daisy Warwick affair, which broke open in 1913 and 1914, was the first significant test of this new management. Lord Stamfordham, whose loyalty to the institution ran through 2 reigns without apparent diminishment, handled it with the same professional competence he had brought to every previous crisis. The legal mechanism, the copyright argument, was deployed first. When that proved insufficient, the financial mechanism, Ducrot and the £64,000 completed the management. Alice Keppel, after her 2 years abroad, returned to England and managed her own transition with the quiet effectiveness that characterized everything she did. She was received in society. She was included where appropriate in events. She was not excluded in the pointed way that Daisy had been excluded from Bertie's circle after their affair ended. She was simply a woman who had held a particular position in the previous reign and now held a different position in the current one, and she managed this with the same skill she had brought to everything. Her husband George continued in his various business capacities. Their daughters grew up. Violet became Violet. Sonia became Sonia. The family went on with the particular resilience of people who have survived something and decided to proceed rather than examine what they have survived. Alice Keppel went to Florence in the 1920s and gardened and hosted and lived well for another 20 years. She was still alive when the Second World War began, still alive when the Kensington Gardens were dug up for Victory Gardens, still alive when the world she had been most fully herself in was so thoroughly transformed as to be unrecognizable. She died in September of 1947, 8 weeks after the birth of the great-granddaughter who would eventually complete a version of the story she had lived. This is the thing about the women around King Edward VII that the Code of Silence most effectively obscured, and that only the surviving fragments allow us to partially reconstruct. They were interesting on their own terms, not interesting because of him, not interesting as accessories to a great man's biography, interesting as specific people with specific intelligences and specific trajectories in a specific world, whose choices were shaped by that world, and who shaped it in return. Lillie Langtry built a career out of nothing that official society was prepared to offer her, and sustained it across 4 continents for 40 years. Daisy Warwick turned the specific experience of being a royal mistress into a platform for socialist politics, and then ran for parliament at a time when women had only recently been permitted to do so. Agnes Keyser founded a hospital in her own drawing room that still operates. Alexandra moved through 47 years of a marriage that offered her enormous public prominence and enormous private difficulty, and maintained through all of it the quality of being genuinely liked by the people she met, which is not a given even for queens. Alice Keppel managed one of the most visible and socially complex positions in Edwardian England, with an intelligence and a discretion that her world held as an informal standard. The code of silence that surrounded all of them was designed to protect the man, but it also incidentally protected them from public exposure, from legal vulnerability, from the specific forms of social destruction that the Edwardian world applied to women who were perceived as having behaved badly. The protection was real, even though it was a byproduct of a system that was not designed with their interests as its primary consideration. What they gave up in exchange for that protection was the ability to tell their own stories, to say, directly and without calculation, what they had experienced and what they had felt and what it had cost them, to have their understanding of the relationship on the record alongside his, to be present in full in the account of their own lives. Most of them accepted this. Some of them tried to find ways around it and found those ways blocked. One of them eventually found, in a world that had changed enough to make it possible, a route to the official acknowledgement that Alice Keppel could never have reached. The women around King Edward VII were never supposed to speak about it. The ones who did not are in the record as absence, as burned letters, as sealed archives, as hospital corridors and wine labels, and the particular quality of a smile maintained for 47 years in difficult company. The women who came after them, who learned from their example or rebelled against it, are in the record as presence, for better and for worse, in a world that had lost the architecture that made the silence possible and had not yet built anything to replace it. The code ended. The world it had protected went on, changed by the ending. The specific world that produced these women was one that historians have spent considerable effort reconstructing, partly because it is so thoroughly documented in the diaries and letters and memoirs of its participants, and partly because the version of itself it left in those records is so carefully curated as to require reconstruction rather than simple reading. The great country houses of late Victorian and Edwardian England were machines for social management. They had been designed over generations for exactly this purpose, to house large numbers of people in proximity for extended periods while maintaining the specific social distances and social intimacies that the culture required. The guest bedrooms were organized in ways that were not accidental. The corridors were built to provide routes that were not the obvious routes. The staff had been trained through long practice to move through their own separate network of passages without intruding on the passages their employers used. The timing of when certain doors were locked and when they were not was managed by housekeepers whose professional competence included knowing which guests needed which access at which hours. This was not unique to the houses that Bertie visited, though the houses that Bertie visited refined the practice to a particular level. Country house culture across England operated on similar principles. The Victorian upper class had a gap between its public moral standards and its private behaviour that was managed through a combination of the specific physical architecture described above and the equally specific social architecture of what was acknowledged and what was not. What was specific to Bertie's circle was the scale, the prominence, and the length of time it operated. For 4 decades, the Marlborough House set was the most socially significant collection of people in England, and the specific moral arrangements that governed it were consequently the most visible, most imitated, and most carefully managed of any in the country. The specific women who moved through this world and managed their positions within it were products of a very particular kind of education. Not the formal education which was minimal for women regardless of class in this era, but the social education that the upper classes provided through a combination of observation, instruction, and the specific form of trial and error available to people who could afford to recover from error. These women understood, from childhood, how rooms worked, who sat where, what it meant, what the deference shown to certain people communicated, what the exclusion of certain other people communicated. They understood this before they could have articulated it in theoretical terms, and the understanding was so thoroughly embedded in their social instincts by the time they reached adulthood that it appeared, to people who lacked this training, to be a natural gift. It was not a natural gift. It was a specific education available to a specific class, and Alice Keppel had received it more thoroughly than almost anyone. The question of what the women in this account found genuinely appealing about the Prince of Wales, beyond the obvious advantages of the position, is worth addressing directly because the record contains evidence of genuine feeling that was not simply performed for social purposes. Alice Keppel's grief at the deathbed was real. Whatever the composed, managed Alice was in every other context, the woman who broke down in that corridor in May of 1910 was not performing. Daisy Warwick's attachment across 9 years had an intensity that the surviving evidence suggests was not simply political or financial or strategic. Lillie Langtry, who had every incentive to frame the relationship purely in transactional terms in the memoir she wrote 40 years later, still wrote about it with a warmth that reads as authentic. Why? The most direct answer is that he was, by virtually every account, genuinely charming in a way that went beyond the performance of charm. He was interested in people. He was not performing the interest as a social technique. He genuinely found people interesting and found the company of people he liked genuinely pleasurable. He was physically warm. He was funny. He had a kind of ease with himself that men raised as he had been raised were not supposed to develop, and the ease came from 40 years of building a world around pleasure and finding that the world responded well to the approach. He also, and this is less often noted, liked the women he became close to. He was not simply seeking bodies. He sought out specific women and stayed close to them because there was something specific in each of them that he valued and enjoyed. Lily's nerve and humor, Daisy's political intelligence and willingness to argue with him, Alice's management genius and her ability to be genuinely calming in a way that reduced the specific anxiety that came with being who he was, Agnes Keyser's quiet companionship, and the hospital that bore his name. These were people he chose because they had qualities he appreciated, not simply because they were available or beautiful. The beauty was a prerequisite in the specific way that a certain kind of technical competence is a prerequisite for a position, necessary but not sufficient. The women who responded to this, who chose to be close to him in the specific ways the system allowed, were not simply making social and financial calculations, though they were also making those. They were responding to a person who genuinely wanted their company, who made them feel that the specific combination of qualities they possessed was the most interesting combination in any room he was in. That feeling, when it is genuine rather than manufactured, is one of the most powerful things one person can give another. The code of silence required them to say nothing about this in public. The code did not require them to stop feeling it. The code of silence was not experienced identically by all the women who lived inside it. The specific way it affected each woman depended on what she had brought into the arrangement and what she needed from it. For Alexandra, the code was externally imposed in a way that was different from its imposition on the others. She had not chosen to be in the Marlborough House set. She had been born into the position of Princess of Wales by her marriage, and the set was the world her husband had built around him. The code required her to accept the arrangements as facts about the world, rather than as choices that could be disputed, and to maintain her dignity within those facts, rather than spending her energy fighting the facts themselves. She chose this approach, but she chose it within a context that offered her very few alternatives. What she received for this choice was the permanent position, the public love, and the particular respect that attaches to a woman who has been through a great deal and maintained herself throughout. What it cost her is in the burned letters. For Lillie Langtry, the code was something she entered voluntarily and moved through with skill, and what it gave her was enormous, and what it cost her was a daughter who could not be publicly acknowledged, a husband who was barely present and eventually drunk, and the specific challenge of converting celebrity into a sustainable life in a world that was not organized to help women do so. She managed the conversion with remarkable efficiency, but she did it despite the system, not because of it. For Daisy Warwick, the code was something she accepted and then rejected, in the specific form of rejecting the financial implications of the acceptance. She had been inside the system, had received the social benefits and the romantic attention, and had then found herself on the outside of it, without the material support that she had perhaps assumed would be more lasting. Her attempt to sell the letters was not simply greed. It was a woman deciding that the silence she had maintained was worth more than it had been compensated for, and attempting to recalibrate the exchange after the fact. The attempt failed, in the sense that the letters were not published. It succeeded in the sense that she received £64,000 for not publishing them. Whether this constitutes justice or whether it constitutes a different kind of transaction entirely, is a judgment that depends on what framework you bring to the evaluation. The specific role Rosa Lewis played in the Edwardian world deserves more attention than the brief sketch already provided, because her position was unique in a way that helps illuminate the system's mechanics. She was not a participant in the romantic arrangements of the Marlborough House set. She was the person who made those arrangements physically possible, and she did so through a combination of professional skill and personal intelligence that is underrepresented in the histories of the period. Her cooking was extraordinary. This bears emphasis because it was the foundation of everything else. She could produce elaborate multi-course dinners at very short notice for very large numbers of people, with a consistency and a quality that made her services sought after by everyone who entertained at the level that Bertie's circle entertained. She worked for the prince at various locations, and over many years, she learned through this work, not just how to manage a kitchen but how to manage a world. The Cavendish Hotel was in some ways the physical residue of this learning. It was a place where people who needed to be somewhere they would not be formally observed could be. It was managed by a woman who had been managing exactly this kind of situation, in a domestic context, for decades. The transition from managing it in a house to managing it in a hotel was simply a change of scale and legal structure. What Rosa Lewis understood, in a way that is worth explicitly stating, was that the management of information was a form of professional skill that could be exercised for pay. She was paid in various currencies to not know things. She was paid in the ongoing commercial relationship of the Cavendish's custom. She was paid in the social currency of being someone who moved through a world that otherwise would have been closed to a clockmaker's daughter from Essex. She was paid in the specific form of trust that people extend to someone who has demonstrated repeatedly that they are absolutely reliable about keeping what they know to themselves. This is what the Code of Silence actually ran on, not simply shared interest, but relationships of professional reliability, in which knowing things and not saying them was a service provided for compensation, and in which the compensation was real and sustained the lives of real people. The comparison between the world Alice Keppel inhabited and the world Diana Spencer inhabited is so stark that it requires careful handling, because the starkness can make the comparison feel like an argument about which approach was better, when it is more accurately an illustration of how thoroughly the world had changed. Alice Keppel kept the code. Diana Spencer broke it. The question is not which of them was right, because that is not how the situation works. The question is what made the difference. Diana Spencer became a member of the royal family in a world that had press coverage, photographic technology, and a public appetite for royal information that would have been unrecognizable to the Edwardian era. She married Prince Charles in 1981 in a ceremony watched by 750 million people worldwide on television. She was, from the moment of her engagement, the most photographed and observed person in Britain. There was no architecture of country house corridors and reliable servants that could manage her situation in the way that Bertie's situation had been managed. She was watched constantly and from the very beginning. The Rosa Lewis story is often reduced to a single detail, that she ran the Cavendish Hotel in Jermyn Street and knew things that could have ruined half the aristocracy. The detail is accurate but insufficient. What Rosa Lewis actually was, at the height of the Edwardian era, was a professional in the specific business of discretion, and she practiced that profession with a rigor that put her clients to shame. She had started as a kitchen maid in the household of Count and Countess Keppel, no relation to George and Alice. She cooked for Edward when he was Prince of Wales, first for the Keppels and then for various other houses that discovered that the prince ate better when she was responsible for the kitchen. She was funny, unflappable, and possessed of the particular intelligence that some people develop when they spend their formative years in service, an acute awareness of exactly what every person in a room needs in order to be comfortable, combined with the professional habit of providing it without being thanked for it. She bought the Cavendish in 1902, the year after Edward became king, and she ran it for the next 50 years with a management philosophy that was essentially identical to the one that governed the country house system she had cooked her way through. You were welcome at the Cavendish if you behaved as though you understood what the Cavendish was for. You were not welcome if you did not. The understanding required was not complex. The hotel existed for people who needed a place to be somewhere without the details of their being there appearing in any record that could be consulted later. Rosa provided this as reliably as she provided the food. The specific mechanics of how she managed information are interesting. She extended credit to the aristocracy in ways that banks would have found peculiar, and the extensions of credit were not purely acts of generosity. A man who owed Rosa money was a man who had additional reason to maintain the understanding. The ledger of obligations at the Cavendish was not a financial document only, it was also a social one. She knew where people had been on nights when they were officially somewhere else. She knew which of the respectable married men who came through her door were collecting their dignity on the way out. She knew, and the knowing was its own currency, though she spent almost none of it. When she was old, in the 1940s, a journalist named Daphne Fielding spent time with her and eventually wrote a book about her life. Rosa was willing to talk, as old women sometimes are, about the general texture of the world she had inhabited. She was not willing to talk about specific people or specific events. She was still, at 80, maintaining the professional habit of a lifetime. She said things like the world has changed and the world was better as it was, and left the specifics to the listener's imagination. The listener's imagination was, by then, working with more material than Rosa had provided. The Cavendish was requisitioned during the Second World War, and Rosa never fully recovered the business afterward. She died in 1952 and was buried with modest ceremony. The hotel continued without her for a while, and was then rebuilt in the 1960s into something that shared the name and not much else. She is remembered primarily as a character, the colourful Cockney cook who managed the Edwardian aristocracy's secrets. This memory does her a slight injustice. The colourful exterior was real, but it was also partly managed. Rosa knew what she was doing when she was colourful. It was another form of discretion. The easiest way to be present in a room where sensitive things were happening was to be the person everyone found entertaining, because entertaining people were watched less carefully than serious ones. Agnes Keyser managed her own visibility differently, by removing it entirely. She was 53 years old when her affair with Edward VII apparently began, if affair is even the right word for something that left so little trace in the record. She came from a banking family, was well connected in the medical world through her own philanthropic activity, and met the prince through the normal channels of upper-class Edwardian society. He visited her house in Grosvenor Crescent regularly from around 1898 onward. She provided him with what people who knew him described as a kind of quiet domestic comfort that was different in character from what Alice Keppel provided, less political, less publicly visible, more simply restful. When the South African War began in 1899 and the public and private hospitals were overwhelmed with casualties, Agnes converted her Grosvenor Crescent house into a hospital for officers. She paid for it largely from her own resources, with some assistance from sympathetic donors, of whom Edward was one. The hospital specialized in surgical cases that required extended recovery time, and it developed a reputation for the quality of its care that outlasted both Agnes and the king. When Edward became king in 1901, he became patron of the hospital and retained a connection to it that lasted the rest of his life. Agnes ran the hospital, continued to see the king, and said nothing public about either activity beyond what was strictly necessary. She died in 1941, having given 91 years to the quiet management of things that needed managing. She had outlived Victoria, Edward, the First World War, and the social world that had produced her. She had outlived it without describing it. The letters Edward wrote to her, if he wrote letters to her, are not in the public record. The nature of what passed between them during those Grosvenor Crescent visits is not in the public record. Whether this is because there was nothing of note, or because she was successful enough at her management to leave nothing that could be noted, is one of the questions the record cannot answer. The hospital that carries the king's name in Beaumont Street continues to operate. It is a private hospital now, in the way that private hospitals operate now, with health insurance and appointment systems and a website. The connection to Agnes Keyser is mentioned in its history. The connection between Agnes and the king is mentioned more briefly. The letters, if they existed, are not mentioned at all. Edward's relationship with France deserves its own account because France was where he was most himself in public, which means it was also where the women around him were most visible. He had been visiting Paris since the 1860s, and he had, over decades, developed something between a passionate attachment and a professional relationship with the city. He spoke French fluently, understood the French social codes well enough to move through them without friction, and was received by Parisian society with a warmth that London, where everyone knew his mother's opinion of him, could not quite match. The specific women he saw in Paris were, by the standards of the Edwardian Code, categorically different from the women he maintained relationships with in England. The grandes cocottes, the high courtesans of the Belle Époque, operated under a completely different social and moral framework. They were not wives, not daughters of the aristocracy, not women who had reputations to maintain in the same way that the women of the Marlborough House set did. They were professionals, in the specific sense that their entire position rested on being worth the considerable expense they required, and they were very good at their work. La Belle Otero, born Carolina Otero in Galicia in 1868, was a dancer and actress who by the 1890s had accumulated a roster of wealthy admirers that included several monarchs. She was magnificent to look at, funny in the specific way that very beautiful women sometimes are when they do not need to perform attractiveness but only presence, and she had a talent for spectacle that the Moulin Rouge had helped refine into something close to an art. Whether Edward's connection to her went beyond the social level is not clear from the surviving accounts. What is clear is that she was part of the Parisian world he moved through most freely, and that the Parisian world he moved through most freely was the one that asked nothing of him except that he be present and appreciative. Cléo de Mérode was another figure of the Paris he knew. She was a dancer at the Opera Ballet, famously beautiful, whose name appeared in connection with Leopold II of Belgium, among others. Whether she and Edward had any contact beyond the social level is similarly unclear. The point of mentioning them is not to add to the list of conquests, but to note that the Parisian context was one in which Edward operated with a freedom from the specific codes that governed the London context. The French understood perfectly well that a man of his position would have relations outside his marriage. They simply did not attach to this the particular moral weight that the Victorian English were trained to attach to it. The difference between the Parisian approach and the London approach illuminates something about the code that governed the women in this account. The code was not a universal human arrangement about discretion in complicated relationships. It was a specific English class production generated by the intersection of the Victorian moral emphasis on public respectability, the aristocratic tradition of managing private behavior through institutional means rather than individual virtue, and the particular pressures that came with the kind of visibility that attached to the Prince of Wales and then the King of England. In Paris, none of that applied. In London, all of it did, constantly, and the women who managed it most successfully were the ones who understood the system completely enough to work within it without being consumed by it. What the Paris visits gave Edward was a laboratory in which the rules were different, and what the different rules showed him each time he returned was how thoroughly the English rules shaped every aspect of the English arrangements. The freedom of the Parisian visits was real, but it was also bounded. He always returned. The world he had to return to was the world the women in this account were helping him maintain. This maintenance was not abstract. It had a daily texture. It required specific decisions, specific management of specific situations, across hundreds of interactions over the course of years. The women who did it best were the ones who had internalized the requirements so thoroughly that the management became invisible, even to themselves. The women who struggled with it were the ones who kept encountering the gap between what the situation required and what they actually felt, and who could not close that gap without cost to one side or the other. Daisy Warwick kept encountering the gap for years before she tried to act on it. The 9-year affair with Edward ended and she converted to socialism, and the gap did not close. The letters sat in her possession for more than a decade, while she ran down the resources that had made the Edwardian world comfortable for her, and the gap between what she had given to the system and what she had received from it became the subject of a slow building grievance that eventually found its expression in the attempt to sell what she had kept. She was not wrong that she had been used by the system. She was not wrong that the system had protected itself at her expense in various specific ways. She was working within the limits of the options available to women of her class and era when she attempted to convert the letters into money, which was the only form of power the system had left her with. The attempt failed, as such attempts tended to fail when the system brought its full institutional weight to bear on them. But the failure does not mean the grievance was invented. The £64,000 that Arthur de Croce paid on behalf of the Crown in 1914 was not a charitable act. It was the price of maintaining the code in a case where the code had already been breached enough that the breach had to be contained rather than prevented. De Croce became a baronet in 1916. These things are in the record. The connection between the two events is not documented in any official source. The connection is visible nonetheless. There is a particular quality to the photographs that survive of Alexandra from the years after Edward's death. She continued her public duties as Queen Mother with the same composed attention she had brought to everything else. She attended ceremonies, she opened buildings, she received visitors. She was, by all surviving accounts, warm with the people she met and fond of her grandchildren, and genuinely glad to be back in Denmark when she went, which she did as often as her health and her position allowed. She died on November 20, 1925 at Sandringham, the house she had loved best of all the houses she had lived in across her 47 years of marriage and her 15 years of widowhood. She was 80 years old. She had outlived her husband by 15 years and her eldest son Albert Victor, who had died in 1892 before he could become king, by 33 years. She had outlived one version of England entirely and was present for the early stages of a different one. Her closest companions in the last years were her surviving children and her dogs. She had always had dogs, the small and specific kind of dog that people who live in large houses and need something that will be glad to see them keep. The dogs did not know what was required of them in terms of public composure. They were simply glad to see her. She apparently found this restful. The letters she had written to her family over the decades were private and affectionate, and occasionally in the coded language available to her, revealing about things she would not say directly. Some survive, most were destroyed by her own instruction. She had watched the Daisy Warwick situation from close range and drawn her own conclusions about what letters left in the world could produce. The burning of letters is not an act of shame. It is an act of authorship, the decision about which parts of your life will remain in the record and which will not. Alexandra burned her letters and kept her limp, and was adored by the British public until she died, and is remembered, when she is remembered, as the dignified wife of an unfaithful king, which is accurate and insufficient in equal measure. What she actually was, which the burning of the letters was designed to prevent from being fully visible, was a woman of considerable intelligence and considerable endurance who had spent half a century making decisions about how to live inside a situation she had not chosen and could not have fully anticipated, and who had managed those decisions with a coherence that deserves more credit than the word dignified quite captures. She understood the terms, she worked within them. She protected, by working within them, things she genuinely cared about: her children, her position, the stability of an institution she had married into and made her own. She gave up, by working within them, the ability to say directly what the terms had cost her. The cost was real. The management was real. Both things were true at once, as they tend to be in the lives of people who are navigating very difficult situations with limited options and a great deal of intelligence. The women around King Edward VII were never supposed to speak about it. Most of them did not. Alexandra spoke about it only in the language of action, in the management of her household, in the raising of her children, in the burning of her letters, in the 15 years she spent as the most popular woman in England while her husband's attentions were comprehensively elsewhere. She said, with everything she did and very little of what she said, that the terms were what they were and she had decided to live inside them without surrendering what she could keep. That is a kind of speaking. It is not the kind the code was trying to prevent, but it is the kind that lasted. She was also in a marriage that was not functioning in a way she could understand as functional, with a man whose emotional investment was elsewhere, and she had been inside that marriage long enough to know that the official version of it was not the actual version, and that maintaining the official version was costing her something she could not continue to pay. If you have stayed with this story to its end, thank you for the time you have given to the women around King Edward VII. These are the histories that official accounts smooth over, but they tell you more about how power actually worked than almost anything in the formal record. Subscribe now if you have not already, leave a comment telling us which woman's story stayed with you, and share this documentary with someone who loves the real history of the British royal family. New documentaries on the hidden lives of the monarchy are published every week. We will see you in the next one. The Panorama interview was broadcast in November of 1995, a year before the official divorce. She spoke for 55 minutes. She was calm, direct, and specific. She confirmed the affair with James Hewitt. She described the state of her marriage. She said the famous thing about there being 3 people in it. She said she wanted to be queen of people's hearts. The response was immediate and overwhelming. The palace was furious. The Prime Minister called for a swift resolution to the situation. Millions of people watched and formed strong opinions and wrote letters. It was by any measure a rupture. What the interview demonstrated, among other things, was that the code of silence was no longer enforceable in the same way it had been in Alice Keppel's era, because the institutions that had enforced it, the press, the legal system, the social hierarchy, had changed in ways that made the enforcement much harder. A woman could now go on television and speak directly to a public that had no interest in maintaining the official version, and the public would believe her, and the institution would have to respond. Whether this is progress depends on what you think the code was protecting and what you think it was obscuring. The code protected the stability of an institution at the cost of the specific experiences of the women inside it. The breaking of the code exposed the specific experiences of one woman at the cost of some measure of institutional stability. Both of these outcomes involve real people and real costs. The title of this account, "The Women Around King Edward VII Were Never Supposed to Speak About It," contains a slight ambiguity that is worth noticing at the end. What precisely were they never supposed to speak about? The obvious answer is the affairs, the specific arrangements. The things that happened in the corridors of country houses and the private rooms of London hotels and the bedrooms of palaces, the things that the system was designed to make invisible. But there is a second, less obvious answer: they were never supposed to speak about what it cost them. The specific experience of being inside the arrangement, the specific weight of the silence, the specific things that the code required them to contain and perform and manage, and never in any context where it might be heard by the wrong people, expressed directly. Alexandra never spoke about what it was like to be married to a man who was serially unfaithful, to know exactly who was there and exactly what was happening, to maintain a public dignity that required the constant suppression of whatever she actually felt. She burned the letters that might have told us. She gave the world the performance and kept the rest. Alice Keppel never spoke about what it was like to love a man who was not and could not be fully hers, to give 12 years of intelligence and attention and management and care to a relationship that had to be conducted in permanent semi-secrecy, and then to be ordered out of the deathbed and allowed to attend the funeral through a side entrance. She said things were done better in her day and kept the rest. Lillie Langtry never spoke about what it was like to be the first woman in a series that would go on for decades, to be the one who cleared the path for the system that would follow, and to have done it while trying to manage a drunk husband and an unacknowledged daughter, and a career built on the ruins of a social position that the affair had made impossible to maintain on its original terms. She wrote charming memoirs and kept the rest. Daisy Warwick tried to speak. She tried to sell the letters. She tried to write the memoir. She found, each time, the institution in her way: the copyright law, the court order, the man with £64,000. She eventually published something, and what she published was so carefully managed that the thing she had been trying to say was still not quite in it. The silence these women maintained was not entirely chosen. Some of it was enforced through mechanisms as specific as legal injunctions and financial leverage. Some of it was enforced through the social architecture of a world that had made the consequences of speaking very clear. Some of it was genuinely chosen by women who had assessed the costs of speaking and decided that the alternative was worth the silence. All of it, chosen or enforced, is present in the record as gap, as absence, as the place where the words would have been if the world had been organized to accommodate them. The things that were never supposed to be spoken about are still, in most cases, not fully spoken. The archive has gaps. The letters are burned, the memoirs are managed, the hospital stands, and the vineyard is there, and the great-granddaughter was anointed queen, and somewhere in the Villa dell'Ombrellino there are things that Alice Keppel thought and felt and did not say. They were never supposed to speak about it. Most of them did not. The silence is what remains, and the silence tells you, if you know how to read it, everything. The specific character of Alexandra and Bertie's marriage in its first years is one of the details that tends to be flattened by subsequent knowledge of how it developed. We read the early years through the lens of what came later, and in doing so miss the genuine warmth that the contemporary accounts record. Bertie was charmed by Alexandra in the immediate and uncomplicated way that some people are charmed by some other people, a way that has nothing calculated about it and everything instinctive. She was beautiful and he found beauty compelling. She was kind and he had grown up inside a family where the specific form of kindness she offered had been largely unavailable. She was warm and direct and physically affectionate with their children in a way that suggested she had decided to give her family the thing she had wanted her own family to give her, and had received, and the decision was so thoroughly executed that it became the primary emotional atmosphere of the household. He was in those early years attentive to her. He arranged for her presentation at his mother's court, which required some careful navigation of Victoria's protective instincts about her son. He introduced her to the people who mattered in his world, with a pride that observers noted. He named his horses with a combination of her initial and affectionate abbreviations. The early domestic life at Marlborough House was, by the accounts of people who saw it regularly, genuinely happy in the way that households are genuinely happy when the people in them like each other and are not yet stranded by the things that will eventually separate them. The separation happened gradually, through the combination of Alexandra's deafness, which isolated her from the specific social mode that her husband's world ran on, and Bertie's specific appetites, which needed more than one marriage to any one person could accommodate. The separation was not a rupture, it was an erosion. The warmth remained for Alexandra, if not the intimacy. The affection remained for Bertie, if not the faithfulness. They were, by the end of their long marriage, people who had spent half a century becoming the particular versions of themselves that the marriage had produced, and who were connected to each other through that production in a way that was real, even though it was not what marriage is supposed to be. The Marlborough House set, as it operated in its prime years from the 1860s through the 1890s, was something specific that has not quite been replicated since. It was the centre of fashionable England in a way that required a centre to exist, which required in turn a social hierarchy sufficiently fixed that everyone knew where they were in it, sufficiently mobile that interesting people from outside it could be admitted, and sufficiently informal that admission meant something more than simply standing in the right room. The aristocracy that formed the set's permanent membership had been running its country houses for generations and had developed a set of practices around the management of guests that was the product of long institutional evolution. The servants were professional in a way that is not quite the same as what professional means now. They were people whose entire identity was organized around the performance of their function, and whose function included knowing things that helped their employers and not knowing things that might embarrass them. The middle layer of the set, the people who were invited because they were interesting rather than because they were hereditary, included Bertie's specific enthusiasms: theatre people, financiers, Americans, artists. This group brought things that the aristocracy could not provide internally: fresh conversation, different perspectives, the specific energy of people who had made their position rather than inherited it. They also brought a different relationship to the rules, since people who have made their position tend to understand that position as contingent in a way that people who inherited it do not, and this understanding produces a specific kind of awareness of what maintaining the position requires. Lillie Langtry moved through this set from outside it. She entered it through a combination of beauty and royal attention and her own particular social intelligence, and she moved through it with the specific confidence of someone who had nothing to lose because she had arrived with nothing at stake. She was not defending a family name or a hereditary position. She was building something from scratch, which meant the only things she had to manage were her reputation and her access, and she managed both with a thoroughness that the permanent members of the set found alternately impressive and unnerving. Alice Keppel moved through it from within a slightly different position. She was aristocratic enough to understand the set's internal codes, connected enough through her husband's family to have social standing independent of the royal connection, and intelligent enough about the political dimensions of the world she was in to function as something more than a companion. She was useful to the set in ways that went beyond the romantic relationship. This distinction between the two women, the one who arrived as an outsider and built access, and the one who arrived with access and built influence, is one of the more interesting structural differences between their positions. The specific form of each woman's silence tells you something about who she was, beyond the general observation that they all maintained the code. Alexandra's silence was comprehensive and deliberate. She destroyed documents. She said very little in the public record beyond the required formulas of official appearances and the warmth she showed in her private letters to family, which contained the code rather than challenging it. The silence was a choice made once, decades into the marriage, and maintained consistently for the rest of her life. It had the quality of a decision rather than a performance. Lillie Langtry's silence was selective and strategic. She wrote 2 volumes of memoir. She gave interviews. She was, in her later career, not a private person, but the silence about the specific private dimensions of the royal affair was maintained throughout all the public discussion, and the maintenance was skillful enough that the public discussion and the silence coexisted without obvious contradiction. She knew exactly what she was choosing to say and what she was choosing not to say, and the choices were made with the intelligence of a woman who had learned early that information was an asset and that some assets were more valuable unspent. Daisy Warwick's silence was involuntary in a way the others were not. She did not choose to keep the letters private. She tried to publish them and was prevented, then tried to sell them and was bought off. The silence she ultimately kept was purchased rather than given, which makes it categorically different from the others in terms of what it reveals about the system's mechanisms. The code, in Daisy's case, was enforced rather than accepted. Agnes Keyser's silence was, of all of them, the most complete and the most apparently voluntary. She left no memoir, gave no interviews that survive, expressed no public opinion about any aspect of the relationship. She left a hospital and a blank. Whether the blank was the product of a deliberate decision to leave nothing, or simply of a temperament that did not incline toward public expression, is one of those questions that cannot be answered from the available evidence. Alice Keppel's silence was professional in character, which is the most interesting form. She was an intelligent woman who had moved through a world that ran on the management of information, and she applied the same intelligence to the management of her own story that she had applied to everything else. The things she said were interesting, often witty, and consistently in service of a narrative about herself that was accurate in everything except the things she chose not to say. This is not dishonesty, it is a specific form of authorship that the code required and that she was very good at. The institutional mechanisms the British royal family developed over the course of the Victorian and Edwardian periods for managing information are worth understanding because they explain how the code was enforced at the systemic level, beyond the individual choices of the women involved. The first mechanism was legal. The law of libel, as it operated in late Victorian England, made it genuinely dangerous to publish certain kinds of accusations about named individuals. The standard for successful libel prosecution favored the plaintiff in ways that made newspapers cautious about specific claims, particularly where powerful people were concerned. The Prince of Wales had access to legal counsel of a quality and promptness that most individuals could not match, and the threat of legal action was not an empty one. The second mechanism was social. The structure of the Marlborough House set and the wider aristocratic world meant that information that reached the wrong people had social consequences that were essentially permanent. To be excluded from the set was a form of social death in that world. To be the person whose indiscretion had caused the exclusion of another was also a form of social death. The social costs of speaking were distributed in ways that made discretion rational for almost everyone inside the system. The third mechanism was financial. The combination of employment dependency for servants and the specific forms of material support available to women who maintained the code meant that the financial logic of silence was robust. A lady's maid who talked was a lady's maid without a position. A woman who maintained the code in the relationship might receive specific material support, access to resources, help with the kind of problems that money solves. This was not stated explicitly, it did not need to be. The fourth mechanism was the copyright argument that Stamfordham deployed against Daisy Warwick, the specific legal principle that the writer of a letter owns its copyright, not the recipient, meaning that letters written by the king could not be published by anyone without the king's permission. This is still in modified form current law in Britain. It is a mechanism specifically designed to protect the private communications of individuals from publication, and in the context of the Daisy Warwick case, it functioned as institutional protection for the monarchy's reputation. These four mechanisms together produced a system that was quite resilient to individual defection, because defection was costly on multiple dimensions simultaneously. The code worked not because everyone inside it was virtuous, but because the system made virtue and self-interest coincide in most cases. What remains of the world of the women around King Edward VII is not in the end primarily the silences, it is the things the silences were built around. The hospital Agnes Keyser founded continues to serve patients. The theatre career Lillie Langtry built changed, in a small but real way, how the acting profession was regarded in England, and that change persisted. The socialist institutions Daisy Warwick funded outlived her, and the college she established at Studley trained generations of women in agricultural and horticultural skills that the 20th century would find useful. Alexandra's children and grandchildren populated the royal families of Europe, and through George V, who held the British monarchy together through the First World War when 3 of his royal cousins lost their thrones, contributed to the specific stability of the institution she had given so much to maintain. She was, in the final accounting, partly the reason the British monarchy survived a century that ended a great many others. Alice Keppel's family continued. Sonia's memoir is still read, and it still tells you something. The villa in Florence still stands. The hospital bearing Edward VII's name still operates, with its dual connection, the king and the woman who loved him, and is somehow never quite named in the connection. Camilla Parker Bowles was crowned Queen Consort in May of 2023 in Westminster Abbey, with the Archbishop of Canterbury officiating and the institution of the Church of England formally blessing an arrangement it had spent the previous 2 centuries managing, containing, and occasionally preventing by other means. Alice Keppel would have recognized the shape of the story, even if she would have found the ending impossible to have predicted. A woman who had moved through the specific world she moved through would not have expected to see the wheel complete its turn so formally, so publicly, so loudly. Things were done differently in her day. Whether they were done better depends on what you are measuring.